All righty. All right, guys. Welcome to Altitude Diving. My name is Benjamin Hadfield. I am a technical dive instructor. I'm also a master instructor and fully qualified to teach this class. Plus, my wife and I probably do 90% of our dives at altitude as well. So we've got a little bit of experience and happy to share that with you guys as well. Overall, through this course, I'll be asking a lot of questions and going through a lot of interesting stuff as well. So my route to technical diving and to altitude diving is I started diving in Idaho, enjoying it thoroughly, and then moved out and tried to dive every other lake that I possibly could in the state, as well as in Wyoming. That photo over here to the right, that's us getting ready to go over and dive Yellowstone National Lake, which we're pretty well known for doing it. And this is me diving side mount on one of the spires in Yellowstone Lake, taken by National Geographic. So kind of a cool thing. We've led a lot of people around in high altitude dives. If you guys could, on your personal paperwork, if you would, make sure you have a MySSI account, that you have logged into your MySSI account, that you've added a headshot. Believe it or not, I can't certify you or give you the certification without a headshot. And you'll have to go through and make sure you've done all your personal papers as well. In terms of divers, the assumption of liability, things like that as well. So if you would, make sure those are all done as well. There is no homework on this for you other than I will send off a personal homework question to everybody if you just return that via email. And I also send you off a DocuSign to sign you off on that as well. Just be aware. The diver diving for SSI works pretty straightforward. I'm going to give you some knowledge, help you develop some skills. We're going to talk about the proper equipment. We really can't get into proper equipment on this, and proper experience. So, excuse me, proper experience for me works out in two directions. I'm going to help you gain experience, but I also want you to have a good experience with everything as well. So if you're not having fun in my class, please speak up and say, I'm not having fun. And I'll turn off your mic and I'll kick you out of class. I'm just kidding. I won't actually do that. In terms of high altitude diving, there's a lot of opportunity. This is Bear Lake, and we're going to get to watch that on YouTube apparently. Hold on a second. And let me change over from Keynote. Okay, there we go. Oh, the joy of computers. So let's see. Let me present, share screen, an entire screen this time. And I'll turn. This is one of my favorite places to dive. This is Bear Lake, Idaho. And it's a lot of fun. It's right on the border of Utah and Idaho. Rocky beach to get in, but it's not terribly far to get in. One of the things you'll notice is it's a lot of clear water, very reasonably clear water. So you can see all the way in, and that's my blushing bride that I'm hiking out to as well. So as you can see, we're fully dressed in dry suits because the water is cold. If you do not dive a dry suit, you will regret it. But luckily, it's a close walk to shore, which is definitely a huge bonus as well. And there you go. You can see her fins. Now, one of the things that I'm going to kind of jump a little farther ahead into this because it's definitely a fun video. But one of the things you'll notice that you in high altitude diving, what are we missing, guys? Anybody want to mention what we might be missing that we might see in the Caribbean a lot of?
Visibility.
Visibility is one. This isn't too bad of visibility, but for a lake, and I've dove the ocean with this kind of visibility. But there's something else.
Colorful fish.
Colorful fish. One of the things in diving high altitude, the fish are a little more skittish. So trout, for example, are highly ADD, and by the time you get in their vicinity, they generally disappear and are gone. And the thing you're going to definitely need is a light. So a lot of high altitude diving definitely involves looking at structures and looking at lots of rocks and other things like that. A lot of crawdads. This is interesting in that it's a different kind of lake, and they've got this. I'm blanking on what it is. It's a chemical in the water, or a mineral in the water that turns it blue and then makes it run off. So I'll think of it after a bit. I'm having a brain aneurysm apparently. So I apologize for that, but definitely a little bit different. So as we go through this, our objective today is because of the reduced atmospheric pressure, dives conducted at altitude require more compression than identical dives conducted at sea level. And the standard dive tables can't be used as written. Now, through this class, we're going to learn several alternative approaches to determining safe diving practices for altitude, as well as additional safe diving practices for emergency procedures. So here's the good news for the math geeks. Who's my math geeks in here? Anybody a math geek? I'm a huge math geek. Okay, Tim's a math geek. I'm definitely a math geek. So here's the good news. I'm going to teach you 3 levels of how to figure out how to do an elevation dive, from the hardcore math, which is the way I actually end up doing it because that's the way I like it, to a simpler method, and to a rule of thumb method that if you can remember a couple of numbers, you will be a rockin' sockin' robot and just extra cool as well. So discussion, guys, what does altitude diving mean to you? Who's got it for me?
I think it means a lot of cold water, and you're diving above 1,000 feet.
How about you, Justin? What do you think?
It means being able to go diving anywhere within 4 hours of where I live.
Fair enough. David, you got a thought about what does altitude diving mean to you? David Kingsley.
Being able to teach the specialty at the Valhalla Missile Silo and other altitude areas.
Gotcha. Valhalla Missile Silo. Is that the one in Texas?
Yeah, it sure is, in Abilene.
Right on. That is on my list of wanted dives. We were going to go dive the missile silo in Washington, but I can't get them to return my calls, and I have a hard time sending them $800 if they're not going to return my call. So weird
Right.
like that. Yeah.
I'll answer your call.
There you go. Cool. Tim and Michelle, what does altitude mean to you?
I think technically what I've seen is that it's anything above 1,000 feet, but to us it means being able to dive in Colorado somewhere.
Absolutely.
Up not too far from us is Leadville, which is I think about 11,000 feet. That got something that's supposed to be pretty nice. So
Turquoise Lake up there.
Turquoise Lake.
But so much of the West is like, I don't know, it opens up the arena for where we can go diving, right? Because we'll have a better understanding as far as how altitude impacts, but we're not just limited to, obviously warm water. Warm water is great, but diving here in Illinois, a lot of it is quarries and or Lake Michigan, and it's really cold anyway. So we're both dry suit divers, and it kind of opens up what we can do in the state or even the surrounding states.
Absolutely. And much of the West Coast, from about Nebraska to Washington. I mean, even a lot of places in Arizona are still altitude dives, right?
Yeah.
So you're starting to get into some more desert area, but even Saguaro Lake is still 1,000 feet above sea level. So if you start getting into that, we don't think about that. It's definitely misleading sometimes. How about you, Dave? I think you're muted. There you go.
So for me, it means a lot more diving. I anticipate probably majority of my diving will be at high altitude. It means cold water. So I'm looking forward to getting my dry suit that I ordered and trying that out.
Right on. And how about you, Dave? The other Dave.
Am I muted or not?
You're not muted now.
All right, perfect. To safely and comfortably dive in and around the areas that I live. So
Absolutely. And that's absolutely the goal. So the majority of diving at altitude can present additional risk and may not be as simple as diving at sea level. So this course is going to prepare you for those additional challenges and provide you the ability to safely plan and execute dives at elevations from 1,000 to 10,000 feet. Now, I want to make that very clear. Most of our courses are based upon NITO, as well as the Navy dive tables, and we specifically work with version 7. I have looked at version 8. There's not a tremendous amount of difference. The challenge is neither version 6, 6.5, 7, 7.1, or 8 deal with anything over 10,000 feet. they have a supplement that they will not publish or let anybody apparently look at it because they don't want anybody to know what to do after 10,000 feet. But there is a supplement for after that for additional considerations. So in terms of the standard organization from RAID, GUI, TDI, SDI, SSI, we are looking at up to 10,000 feet. So be aware, if you are diving, utilize this information and add safety precautions. So diving over at altitude, definitely, we've got the definition down. You guys have got that pretty basic idea of the idea is that we're diving between 1,000 and 10,000 feet. We have to take additional considerations because we start to deal with an atmospheric difference. And that's really where we're getting into. We need to get a basic idea and just a review of Boyle's Law. Who remembers Boyle's Law for me? I see some head shaking.
I think it's when equal pressure means equal compaction, something like that. So as pressure, equal amount of pressure means equal amount. Yeah, I don't know the exact words, but that's what I think it means.
The relationship of pressure and volume.
Exactly that. So simply put, as pressure increases, volume decreases. As pressure decreases, volume increases. So we might say that if we had an empty cubic cylinder and it was at 1 atmosphere, we're standing in West Palm Beach, Florida, one of my favorite places to be, and we bring that same cylinder, that empty cylinder that's 1 atmospheric pressure, we can take the valve off, nothing happens. We put the valve back on, we close it up, and we take that same cylinder to 10,000 feet or to Leadville, Colorado. What happens when we open the valve?
So you've opened the valve and closed it at sea level, and then now you're going up in altitude.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it should be
Air will come out.
Yeah, chips.
Air will come out.
Yeah, bags of chips are overcompressed at our altitude just because they were packaged at sea level, so they often explode upon entering. That's a simple way of saying it.
Absolutely. So that's Justin.
I've done a lot of traveling and just driving. I was a truck driver for 1.5 years. So one thing that I did was all my shampoo bottles, mouthwash, anything that I had that was compressible, I always squeezed all the air out of them so that when I went over the mountains, they didn't explode all over my bags. So, very much, the cylinder will do the same thing. It will exhale.
Absolutely. So that's a good thing. So being aware of Boyle's Law is definitely like I said, the simplest way to think about it is as pressure decreases, volume increases. And as pressure increases, volume increases. And so we're used to dealing with that in diving, right? We take an 80 cubic foot cylinder and we go to 33 feet, for example. It's equivalent because the reduction of the gas molecule, the density between the gas molecules or the space between the gas molecules, it's equal to 40 cubic feet, right? Fun story for you. I was diving, teaching a solo course last summer, and I had a 30 cubic foot deco bottle that I had rated at 60% nitrox as my safety bottle, and I was about half empty, and I needed to dump that gas because I wanted to refill it with a 70% or an 80%. I wanted a much higher blend. And the best thing, the shop gets all upset if I don't empty my bottles first, right? And I didn't want to waste it, so I thought, okay, I'll take it and be my safety bottle, right? So I was finishing up, and we were getting ready to closing in on our time to make that ascent to the surface. We were about 60 feet, right about the max for that 55-60% bottle. I was right at the max depth that I went ahead and breathed it down to 0 to the point of nothing there. And then I said, okay, start the ascent. Now I was with a dive buddy, and I had a 3/4 of a tank, half tank of gas on my back with a regular around my neck. So no big deal. I could have just, not a big deal. So I need to put the safety caveat in there for you. Now on a 36-inch hose on my deco bottle, I rose from about 60 feet to 15 feet. Anybody want to guess how many breaths I got out of a 30 cubic foot tank of gas?
10?
3, but that would have been wonderful. But it's interesting. It just one of the few times that Boyle's Law really worked in my favor, and I said, "Woohoo! I like you, Boyle. You and your stupid snakes are my best friend right now. So, and if you haven't heard the story of Boyle's Law, Rob Boyle was this crazy Scottish guy that was putting snakes in containers and on a string and throwing them off into the ocean. He was this crazy Scottish guy, and he discovered that one day when a snake was bleeding a tear, that there must be something happening with the pressure. So, leave it to those Scottish physicists. They are definitely a breed of their own. So one of the good benefits to taking this course, I always like to throw this in, is Dan Insurance. Dan is our best friend, but as we may have heard on the internet, that Dan doesn't always jump to the rescue of the diver. So I encourage you, if you don't have Dan Insurance and you are diving locally, make sure to have Dan Insurance. It will pay 100% of eligible accidents. I think up to $500,000 for even for divers 70 and over in Canada. Dan.org. I think Nikki and I pay about $400 a year for the Big Daddy Bongo $500,000 insurance. Now, the nice thing is with this, now that you're diving altitude, now they have no excuse with which to not say or to say you cannot be covered by our insurance because you were diving in Leadville. So just be aware, having Dan Insurance definitely to your advantage. Now, areas for altitude. One of the things we always think of is the mountainous regions. Things are above 1,000 feet. But David Kingsley, is there places where we might have high plains that are not as obviously mountains that are over 1,000 feet?
Oh, sure. I mean, the Valhalla Missile Silo is a really good example of that. I wouldn't say it's exactly mountainous. It is hilly for sure, but there's definitely a difference between the altitude in Dallas compared to in Abilene, where the silo is located.
Absolutely. So one of the things that you definitely want to take into consideration is two parts of diving in altitude. The first one is driving from wherever you're at to wherever you're going. The second one is when you get done with your dive, what happens if you're in a plane? So, for example, I'm in Idaho Falls and I'm diving around and I decided to go up in altitude. If I go over Mountain Pass, like I go through Malad Pass, that's a good 3,000 feet above where I'm currently at. Could that be a problem?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. So anytime we're rising more than 1,000 feet in altitude, we definitely have to be aware of that for our off-gassing considerations. But how about if I'm driving from here to Yellowstone? Now I am at 4,800 feet right now, where I sit right now. But what if I was at 4,000 feet coming from somewhere lower in Wyoming and going to elevation of 7,800 feet at Yellowstone? How will you think that would affect the dive that I'm getting ready to do?
You're doubling your altitude.
Yep, I'm doubling in altitude. Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, you're doubling in altitude, so yeah, that's definitely going to change. You've got a lot less atmosphere over top of you, so yeah, that's definitely changing what you're going to do.
Absolutely, David Kingsley, you were going to say something. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I was just saying it's definitely going to affect your numbers a bit.
Absolutely. It's definitely going to take, because all of a sudden now we have residual nitrogen because we're ascending in the atmospheric pressure, just like we were ascending in the water column. So interestingly enough, Marcel Korkus set the record for altitude diving on December 13, 2019. He's a Polish diver who dived at an altitude of 6,395 meters, or about 20,981 feet above sea level, setting the absolute world record in altitude diving. He is the first person to dive at such a high altitude. The dive was an experiment, as the dive planning tables end at 10,000 feet. Now, he was diving at the highest level lake on Earth, and that was at this in South America, I believe. And so the challenge with this, the only challenge I have with his world record dive is he dove to a depth of about 8 feet for about 5 minutes. So I don't know that I buy that he dove. I tend to go with the limit of 20 minutes for 20 feet. So he dove at a lake and he decided to call it a dive at 8 feet for 5 minutes. So he could have stayed at least for 10, right? So big wimp. But then again, I mean, who wants to hike that much crap up a freaking mountain, right? So what are some of the benefits to high altitude diving? Is it definitely gives you a lot of new areas to dive. One of the concerns is it gives you the opportunity to see artifacts as well. And so one of the things I want to tell you about this is what's really interesting is you dive somewhere like Yellowstone Lake, and it's not uncommon to find interesting artifacts from days gone by. But here's an interesting thing. Tim, what do you think a definition by the Forest Service definition is an artifact?
Yeah, I don't know. Because I mean, age or I mean, would age?
It goes by age. Yep, age of 50 years
50.
or older.
50 years ain't that long ago. So
No, it's not. I was diving Yellowstone Lake over the summer, and I was coming along, and I was just finishing up about a 2.5-hour dive. I was solo diving and I had the plant tanks, but anyway, I came across a blue crystal ball. It was about this big. It was hollow on the inside. It was broken on the top. It was really pretty. It looked fairly new. I mean, it looked like it could have been dropped in the last day. It had very little sand inside and no growth on it at all. And I picked it up, and I swear to God, I thought it was a toilet ball. I thought it was a glass toilet ball from like a bobber from somebody's yacht or something. I thought, well, isn't that fancy? They have a blue crystal toilet ball in their toilet. Whoa. And so I looked at this, and I picked it up, and I put it in my little sack and continued on the dive and came out, and I was like, look at this. This is neat. And luckily there was a Forest Service young lady that was with us. And I said, here you go. I thought this was interesting. Look, a toilet bowl bottle. They called me up about 3 weeks later and said that wasn't a toilet bowl. That was a fire extinguisher from 1968. Huh. So, and they had to dispose of it because apparently the way it worked is it had a breakable top and it was filled with a chemical mix. And what they would do is throw it at the fire, and it would break and shatter, glass going everywhere, and it would extinguish the fire. But be aware that it's as we start looking at these artifacts in the lakes that we go to, be very careful. If you're on Forest Service land, artifacts absolutely positively can be considered, and you can get a ticket and a fine for that as well. Luckily for me, the Forest Service found out, and they sent me a lovely ticket. It's going to cost me $150 for bringing that out of the lake, even though it looked like trash. So the officer involved said, "We're so sorry. This is the cheapest fine I can give you." He says, "Don't worry, I'm not going to fine your wife as well." And I was like, "Well, thank you." Mighty darn kind of you, buddy. He sounded like he was about 12 years old as well. So be aware as we kind of go through this. We definitely have to be aware of the content down there. And if you do find gold bars, don't tell anybody. Just go home, melt them up, and I'm just kidding. Don't do that. Don't do that. At least don't tell me about it. Other cool things you're going to find. New varieties of underwater life. So there's definitely cool stuff in lakes that you won't see in the ocean. Some of my favorite are the kokanee salmon. I really enjoy going and doing night dives with the kokanee because they get very, very curious. And it's pretty unusual to see kokanee salmon in salt water, for example, right? And so definitely one of those cool things. There are freshwater eels. We've come the sturgeon. I love diving the sturgeon not far from me. They get the biggest one I personally laid next to is about 8 feet long. And they're very, very docile, and they don't seem to care. I have bellied right up next to them and just laid there and looked at them and videoed them with my camera, my little GoPro, and just had the greatest time ever. And they're just like, yeah, whatever. And in about 4 or 5 minutes, they finally get bored and they swim off. But as you're swimming with the sturgeon, they'll bump into you, they'll crash into you. You're like, what just hit me? So definitely new and interesting things to see as well. It's really fun diving the rivers as well, because that's where you'll see the trout. And the trout is fun because you can get behind a rock and you can see the trout just swimming their little butts off, and you're just like, and you can just watch them as well. Other cool things about altitude diving is it gives you definitely more places to dive. For us inland dwellers, if it weren't for the rivers around us and the lakes around us, we wouldn't get to dive as much as we want, right? We're kind of unblessed when it comes to being close to a coast. For me, a coast is 14 hours away, right? And it definitely extends your diving experience as well. I love teaching inland divers in low visibility, because I know that when I turn them loose off a dive boat, they'll be fan-freaking-tastic. Other cool things just to be aware of, SSI is all about the certifications. Some of the cool things you can certainly do are becoming a lake diver instructor or lake elk diver instructor. So be aware there are times where you'll see, I'm just kidding, that is not an actual thing, but this was one of our dive sites in Yellowstone that this is where we always go in because it's the easiest entrance. It's about 20 feet from my truck. And when we started to get in, there was obviously 5 bull elk all in velvet that were very confused by us walking into the water. So be aware that wildlife is definitely a thing to be aware of as well. All right. So we talked about when a scuba cylinder is empty, and your scuba cylinder is empty when the pressure is equal to the absolute pressure. And so there has to be a difference between the pressure for air to flow in and out of your cylinder. So your scuba cylinder is considered empty when it reaches 1 atmosphere and you're at 1 atmosphere. If you take that same empty cylinder to 16,000 feet, which is a half of an atmosphere, 0.5 ATA, and you open the valve, the air is going to come out. It's because you have a decreased pressure, which causes an increase in volume. Now, it'll happen until the cylinder is able to equalize. Now, let's take that same example to depth. If your dive cylinder is empty at 16 feet, the air pressure is 1.5, equaling absolute pressure. Now, be aware that as you come up, pressure decreases and volume decreases. So the atmosphere, as you go up, creates the same dynamic as coming up in the water column as well. And this is a safety point. This is one of the strong reasons that SSI encourages you to always relieve your regulator in your mouth, because as the pressure decreases, volume increases, and boil becomes your best friend. You'll usually get at least another breath or two out of your cylinder and your leg. So a couple of just quick, I feel like we've got a pretty strong group here. So atmospheric pressure is the air pressure at sea level, known as atmospheric pressure, commonly measured in ATA, right? Hydrostatic pressure is the weight of the fluid exerted by the water and force of gravity. And hydrostatic pressure comes from the weight of the water, excluding air pressure. And this is what gauges are used. So a couple quick things. If you're into SSI and you are taking a lot of courses or moving through an instructor, there's a couple of numbers that I encourage you to tattoo it on your wrist if you need to, on your forehead if you'd like to. But freshwater exerts 14.7 psi divided by 34 equals 0.432 psi per foot. So, and saltwater exerts 14.7 psi divided by 33, or 14.45 psi per foot. So saltwater is absolutely heavier. So as we go into the depth in our freshwater, we definitely need to be aware that 34 feet is 1 atmosphere versus 33 feet, what we're currently used to talking about. And so it's definitely to our advantage to be aware of that. Now, the good news is a good dive computer set to freshwater will take that into account. Now, we're dealing a lot with atmospheric pressure. And atmospheric pressure, and to get to absolute pressure at depth, is pretty straightforward. It's absolute pressure equals depth, feet seawater, feet freshwater, divided by atmosphere plus 1, because we need to make sure we're always taking in or subtracting that surface pressure. Make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Who's not picking up what I'm putting down?
Can you repeat the numbers real quick there on the saltwater versus freshwater?
Absolutely.
14 point, what was it?
Freshwater exerts 14.7 psi divided by 34 feet, and that equals 0.432 psi per foot. That's your freshwater pressure per foot. Saltwater exerts 0.445 psi per foot. And the difference being why saltwater is heavier is because the salt. I always love that one because it's like asking what color was Custer's white horse. So one of the interesting things that happens that to our bodies are designed to be in equilibrium with everything around us, right? Our bodies are amazing that way. I mean, if we were saturation divers and we were diving at 1,000 feet off a bell, our bodies would eventually become saturated to the point and they would build an equilibrium. We talk really funny because we're breathing some helium, but we would equalize. Our brain chemistry would equalize to be able to produce the correct amount of oxygen for our body, so we wouldn't have a hypoxic effect or an hyperoxic effect. So we wouldn't have that issue. We would eventually equalize to that. Now, upon ascent to altitude, two things happen. The body off-gasses the excessive nitrogen to come into equilibrium with the lower pressure of nitrogen in the atmosphere. Does that sound familiar at all in terms of diving? Tim, Michelle?
Yep.
Yeah.
Off-gassing nitrogen? We're not even talking about diving. We're just talking about ascending to altitude, going up to some weird place like Colorado or Leadville. I mean, those weird places. Just kidding.
I mean, the air's so much thinner up there, so you don't have as much. So down here to going up there, you do off gas because the compartments at sea level.
Well, the
have
partial
filled to a part.
pressure the partial pressure of the gases changes.
Absolutely. So we're dealing with the nitrogen off-gassing. That also begins a series of complicated adjustments to lower the partial pressure of oxygen. And the first process is called equilibration. And the second is called acclimatization. And it takes approximately 12 hours of altitude is required for an equilibration, and a longer period of time is required for full acclimatization, right? Now, one of the most worst days of my life, I used to be a hardcore runner. I used to love to run a lot. And so I was in the Marine Corps, 19 years old, almost 20 years old. I graduated OCS and TBS and all this, and I'd gone to Camp Pendleton. And I'd spent 6 months in Camp Pendleton at sea level running and doing my 17-minute 3 miles all day long. I could run 17 minutes, 3 miles, 3 to 4 times a day if I needed to. And I did that one time. We had a little competition to see who could run perfect PFT 3 milers, right? I was trying for under 18 minutes, and no big deal. I was a nice little runner. Well, had the brilliant idea the Marine Corps had the brilliant idea to send me to Denver, Colorado, Aurora, Colorado, to a school there. I got off the plane at 11 o'clock, almost midnight that night at Stapleton Airport, checked in, got myself a meal and a drink, and got up the next morning, showered, shaved. Or I didn't shower and shave. I shaved real quick, and I put my PT gear on and said, I'm going to go run me a quick 3 miles. I'm telling you what, I thought I was going to die. I ran the slowest 3 mile I had run in a long time. I think it was like 20 or 21 minutes. And that was like, I thought I was going to die. And it's because my body hadn't had that chance to equalize, right? I'm still off-gassing nitrogen. I'm still equalizing and acclimatizing to that dynamic. Now, one of the other common things that we see about people going to places like Leadville is we see altitude sickness. You ever feel a little bit of altitude sickness?
Yeah. Like when we're going to be skiing next weekend, and we're going to feel it then because we're going from 8,000 to 12 to 13,000, depending on where we're going to go, and increase water, increase calcium, and that helps with altitude sickness. But everyone gets affected by it to varying degrees.
Absolutely. So here's where I'm going to blow your mind just a little bit, hopefully. But you ever thought about altitude sickness as being just another form of DCS?
I could see the correlation. That's interesting. I wouldn't have thought it that way initially.
Go back and read the signs and symptoms for mild DCS, and then go back and read the signs and symptoms for mild altitude sickness. You might be surprised. Basically, what's happening is your body's equalizing. It's readjusting its ability to process oxygen. It's readjusting and off-gassing nitrogen out of your system. And so people go to a higher altitude. They're off-gassing the nitrogen. Their brain's not processing oxygen the same way. It's very much a light form of DCS. So something to think about as you start to move up in these altitudes. You've got to be gentle with yourself. And one of the things I want to tell you the most of is when diving, or sure, don't tell you the most of, but tell you about is as you're doing these dives, be gentle with yourself. The water will be there tomorrow. So take your time and enjoy what you're doing, and take the time to be able to relax and be properly acclimatized to that altitude. So equilibration at altitude, if a diver begins a dive at an altitude within 12 hours of arrival, the residual nitrogen left over from sea level has to be taken into account. So in effect, the initial dive at altitude can be considered a repetitive dive, with the first dive being the ascent from sea level or the lower altitude to the new altitude. Make sense? But how do we figure out what that repetitive dive is? Who likes, you should all have access to the MySSI app. If you guys would, I'll show you how to get to where I'm going. Go to your MySSI app. Should have your, hopefully you can see it, MySSI app. Down here at the bottom, you'll find the more. And we're looking for tables. And what you want to do is you want to find the combined air nitrox tables. Your easiest way to do that would be move it away from metric and over to US and open. Let's see. There we go. We're looking for table number 2. And I'm going to share my screen so that you can see that. Share screen.
Which table are we in?
We're going to look at table 2.
So you got your first dive. And then
Which heading are we in?
Oh, combined air and / EA and X.
table 2 here because it's
Combined air EA.
And do
You
it
said
in
we're doing
Imperial.
the Imperial, correct?
Yes, I would do Imperial. You're certainly welcome to do metric.
No, thank you.
For most of my technical diving, I do it in metric and convert it back over to Imperial to make so I don't confuse the heck out of my students. The metric is easier. So overall, the example, Jim drives from Idaho Falls, 4,500 foot elevation to Yellowstone Lake, which is an elevation of 7,500 feet. Jim gains 3,000 feet in elevation. Now, to compensate for the elevation increase, Jim will need to start his dive group as a D group diver. And because he's moving 3,000, we're going to simply look to figure out where we're at in the nitrogen off-gassing table. We've got 1, 2, 3,000 feet. So simple enough. For every 1,000 feet, we're going to move one letter group down. So we start as an A. We move one group over to B, C, and D. We can go down, and for him to be completely residual nitrogen free, he needs to be out of the water and pre-dive for 5 hours and 49 minutes to return to an A group diver. So here's your chart. It's very simple. For when you travel, just simply add one letter group for every 1,000 feet of elevation gained. So Tim and Michelle, you guys said you're in Denver?
we're
That's
up
what,
in,
6,000?
we're up in Conifer, so that's 8,100 feet. But yeah,
Yeah, we're
8,100 feet?
yeah.
Okay.
So if you go from Conifer to Leadville, I think you get the 3,000 feet.
yeah.
You gain 3,000 feet. There you go. So you guys in where you're at in Conifer are
8 hours.
Yeah, there we go. So simple enough. Once you get there, you need to make sure that you're allowing this. Now, here's the challenge with this. And the biggest challenge I see is that your dive computer is not designed to measure residual nitrogen unless you're on a dive. Kind of sucks. It doesn't say, okay, right now I see we're at this and then this. It doesn't see that. All it sees is the point where I enter the water. And that's when it begins at annotating nitrogen into your system. Yes, sir. Jim.
Okay.
Justin.
Okay, I've got a question. So, like where I'm sitting, it's about 4,300 feet. So I would be in that D group if I was coming up from sea level. But coming from here and going to Yellowstone Lake, I'm going to go up and over the pass through Cody. That's what, like almost 8,300 feet, something like that, in that neighborhood, coming from that east entrance. Do I have to take into consideration the climb over the peak, or do I just have to worry about where I started and then my duration of time once I'm at the campground there in Yellowstone Valley?
That's a great question. So the answer is yes and no. And the yes, as if you were leaving Yellowstone Lake and going back over, no for going from where you're at to do your first dive. So if I'm doing my first dive, I worry about the beginning elevation and the ending elevation, right? Because that's going to be my nitrogen table. But once I'm leaving Yellowstone Lake and I'm getting ready to go to Cody, I want to make sure I spend enough time out of the water that I allow myself to off-gas that nitrogen to allow for the 1,000-foot gain in elevation. Great question, though. So it's a yes and a no, but it's more likely actually a no and a yes, if you really want to put them into order. So we can use that table very easily. And this is straight from the My SSI app, that as you start looking at, I'm going from one elevation to another elevation. So if I'm going from sea level to 10,000 feet, that's a gain of 10,000 feet. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I'm a K. If I come from 0 to 10, I'm a K group diver. And to get back to an A group diver, I need to stay out for 9 hours, basically 8 hours and 59 minutes to be very exact. And that will allow me to be returned to an A group diver. So remember, as you gain elevation and go out on one of these cool dives that you want to do, make sure you take into account, because anything you do is going to be a repetitive dive, not a first dive of the day, unless you allow yourself time to acclimatize and off-gas the nitrogen that you've gained, that I'm sorry, not gained, but retained from the lower altitude. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. A little mind-blowing sometimes, but it works. Let's see.
So in the same example, say we did the 3,000 feet, that puts us in D, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then say it took us an hour and 20 minutes to get ready. When we got up there, we would technically go from D group back to C group.
Correct.
As far as a repetitive dive. Okay.
You got it. Exactly. You got it exactly. So the longer you stay out of the water before you get in that dive, once you reach the altitude that you're going to do, the lower your nitrogen level will be. So that
time up there is treated as like a surface interval, which is what this chart is, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So one of the questions I usually get around this time as well is, what about the travel time? I encourage you not to count the travel time as well. Give yourself an additional safety margin. And so while you certainly can count that as part of it, the problem is it's very difficult to monitor and stress. So just go ahead and take it as beginning to end. Give yourself the additional time. Why chance it is always my number one rule of thumb. Interesting enough, I was listening to a podcast by Dr. Harry. We all know Dr. Harry, diving anesthesiologist, PhD, ultra genius, and also the anesthesiologist for the Thai rescue divers. We all remember Dr. Harry. And Dr. Harry, I asked him, I said, hey, what do you notice about extreme sports guys that keeps them alive? I thought that was a pretty fair question, because he's interviewed and talked to everybody from Red Bull skydivers to Red Bull wingsuit and squirrel suits to extreme cave divers to he was the first guy to dive hydrogen in a deep cave in New Zealand. And I said, tell me about that, right? What keeps these guys alive? Like, what keeps you alive? And he says the difference between the pros that are that extreme point is they have no problem standing on a 20,000 foot precipice over this massive cliff, looking down and saying, not today. So I thought that was a pretty good analogy, that they have no problem looking at the situation, having an oh crap moment and saying, well, let's try tomorrow. And I asked him, I said, hey, how many times have you called a dive? And he says, I call them all the time. He says, I get into it. I have an oh crap here. I stub my toe. I have a regular free flow that I have to change out. This happens or that happens. He says, I'm like, I'm done. I'm good. We'll do it tomorrow. We're in New Zealand for 3 weeks straight anyway. We don't get it today. We'll get it tomorrow. So I always believe firmly that the lake will be there tomorrow. So I don't know. With this weird winter, who knows?
I don't want to this Dave, one of the three Daves. So I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but on the altitude change while you're traveling and things like that, what do you take into account? Say like in 10 days, I'm going to go dive Homestead. Homestead sits at 6,000.
Mm-hmm.
My starting altitude's at 5,500, 5,600. I'm going to drop into the Salt Lake Valley and be at 4,200 for an hour drive before I then go back up. do I just say my starting altitude, my ending altitude, or do I take into
I would
account the
use your
lower
starting and
altitude?
ending. Use your starting and ending. And a note on Homestead Crater, you're gonna to get out of Homestead Crater, you're gonna have to go up 2,000 feet. No matter which direction you go, you're gonna go up
Mhm.
2,000 feet. So when you get out of the water, you need to be out of the water for at least 4 hours before you drive anywhere out of Homestead. You should, at least. I know plenty of people that do that that don't take that into account, and they do it anyway. But give yourself time. But after, in fact, if you stop there at Homestead, there's a great little Mexican restaurant down there. There's a great Americana restaurant. There's a barbecue restaurant in Homestead. Stop at one of those and get you some food, relax, spend some time, have a Coke and a smile, as Bill Cosby would have said back in the day before he was a major whatever he was now. So yes, Dave Gilmore.
So if, let's say, for example, he did not stop and he did that 2,000-foot elevation gain, would he probably start getting nauseous and headaches and those kind of things? Typical.
Certainly a possibility. Absolutely, certainly a possibility, right? And the challenge with DCS is there's no clear and present. If you do this, you will get the bends, right? There, in terms of light symptoms, right? So. I think right now would probably be a good time to just kind of give a quick break on thing on DCS. There's a few ways you can avoid getting DCS that are pretty substantial, right? The first one to avoiding DCS is good hydration. You think about the blood like the conveyor belt of the body. It's what's going to convey the nitrogen bubbles from your tissue compartments, as Bolman would say, through the venous system to the lungs and exhale them, right? So good hydration is one huge key. Another one's rest. Obviously, if our body is rested, we'll be able to off gas more easily and more competently as well. But there's two huge factors. And if you watch some of my interviews, you'll catch these as well, that will reduce your order of magnitude substantially of the chances of getting the bends. The first one, if you want to, anybody interested in reducing your order of magnitude by at least 5 of getting the bends? There we go. Stay warm. Stay warm during and throughout your dive. That's an easy one, right? If you making sure you're properly geared and that you're staying warm for the beginning of the dive, the middle of the dive, especially the end of the dive. You can be cold during the dive, but if you can get warm at the end of your dive, it reduces by an order of magnitude of 5. Now, that's not the big one, believe it or not. Anybody interested in reducing your order of magnitude by 10 of getting the bends? That's a big one, right? Our friends up in the Nordic regions, Norway, did a study, and they determined that if you do a medium aerobic exercise, that's zone 2 or 3, for 20 minutes a day prior, 24 hours prior to dive, that you reduce the order of magnitude by a factor of 10 of getting the bends. Huge. Order of 10 just by, and the interesting thing is the why. And I always, I like to know the why behind things. Why did that happen? What caused that? Why? And, you know, you can come up with a lot of ideas, right? The guy who invented nitrox is also invented the oxygen bars, right? And he said, well, pure oxygen, we clean the tissues out, or we clean the compartments out of all the free radicals and the Indians and then everything else that was in them, right? The things that weren't supposed to be, the heavy metals or whatever, right? But that's not the reason. What it is it turns out if you exercise the day prior, the body releases an enzyme into the venous system that literally lubricates and smooths out the venous system in such a way that these little bubbles don't have anything to grab onto. And that's the key. The bubbles, if they grab and stop somewhere, another bubble will hit them and they'll perfuse and grow larger. And as they grow larger, then they go from silent bubbles to bubble seeds to problematic bubbles, right? So it's an interesting thing to think about, that if we exercise the day prior to a dive and we stay warm, that we will reduce our order magnitude by an order of 15. So that's pretty big. And so as you start thinking dry suits, and we'll talk more about dry suits later on, if you do wear a heated undergarment, that you make sure that you are able to stay warm without the heated undergarment. And typically, you won't start your dive with a heated undergarment on. You'll turn it on somewhere during the dive, right? And that's usually is the point where the deepest point where you're starting to get cold, then you can warm up and you can start that reascent into your deco procedure, deco points or your off-gassing points, right? And stay warm for that. Now, a final piece of this that I've particularly found to be helpful in diving altitude is I have yet to find somebody that will carry all my crap down to the water, or carry all my crop out of the water, right? There's always some sort of stinking rocky hill or some sort of gosh dang, there were all my curse words in there, hill. The really nice thing about Ryrie, where I dive, is that in the wintertime, all the boats go away. So I just back my truck down to the boat ramp, and then my truck bed is like 12 feet away from the water, which is wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. But other than that, I'm climbing up some sort of daggum freaking stinking hill somewhere. Well, the problem is you've got, in the single tanks, that's 50 pounds plus another 20 pounds with the dry suit and another 10 pounds with garments and another If I'm diving twin sets, my twin sets weigh about 100 pounds with regs, then the extra 20. So I'm 140 pounds with twin sets, right? If I'm diving side mounts, it's a little better. I'll leave my tanks down at the water and I'll hike back up, get changed, and I'll go back and down and get one, and I'll hike back up and I'll hike back down and get the other two, right? And so, or other three, whatever I'm diving, 2, 3, 4, 5 tanks, whatever that is. And that's kind of nice. But the problem is I'm getting out of the water, I'm hiking, I'm creating that huge cardiovascular strain because of all the freaking sticking gear, right? I was praying to God that diver helmet would come into effect and that I was going to be able to dive the helmet thing from Russia, but that guy almost killed himself doing that. So the last piece about this is I would encourage you guys to do a body deco as well. Now, what a body deco basically is once you surface and you get to your point, give yourself 5 or 10 minutes of extra time at that point. Don't have gotten so cold that you're like, I can't feel my fingers and my toes no more. Don't get to that point, right? You're just asking for problems. But allow yourself that little bit extra pressure time in the water to get out and let the nitrogen off gas a little bit. Extend your safety stops and decrease your ascents as well. That'll definitely help. So that's we'll go into that a little bit more as well later on as well. So yes, sir, Dave Gilmore.
So do you off gas faster in the water? Is that why you're saying stay in the water?
Absolutely. You were absolutely off gassing because you're under pressure, but you're not and you're off gassing at your best potential by keeping your head out of the water, your body in the water.
Okay. And so when I go down, we're going to Bon Air next in a couple months, and we're diving multiple times every day. Should I also be doing that 20 minutes exercise each day?
Absolutely. Why not?
Okay.
Now the catch is once you started diving, stop exercising, because the problem is you've already exercised and you're going to off gas faster by exercising. So you stop exercising, you stop using hot tubs, but day before your first dive, start the exercise. And then each day that you're diving is a considered exercise. It's really interesting to watch your heart rate during a dive. I'll get you in just a second, Justin. And so one of the interesting things is watch your heart rate during a dive. If you have a heart rate monitor, you'll typically see on a 60-foot dive that your heart rate will be somewhere between, at least mine is between 80 and 90 on 60 feet. 135 feet, my heart rate generally pops up to about 100, 105 is pretty typical. And I'm a very, very relaxed diver, right? Anybody that watches me dive, I know they say I'm extremely relaxed and I've got good form. So I don't take a lot of effort in the water. But newer divers will take more effort because you're fighting that through the process. So take that extra time before you get on the boat. I like to be the first one off the boat and the last one on the boat. So I let other people get on the ladder first. Yeah, you go in the water. Get out of the water. You have fun because you climb up that daggum ladder with all that gear too. So take that extra 5 or 10 minutes in the water with your head out of the water and just relax and enjoy the water, the warm, the sun, everything else. Okay. Justin.
So that's why you're saying to go ahead and take that 5 or 10 minutes in the water is because you've already exerted yourself and you want to be off gassing, but not at the accelerated rate that you would be if you got right to the shore and started hiking up there, carrying all of your gear, huffing and puffing, getting up to the truck, walking the 3/4 of a mile back to my rig like I've always had to do, carrying all my gear. So that's why you're saying is because that's that time of relaxation to where you can just chill out and let your body off gas to reduce your chances of what I guess some people term an undeserved hit.
Absolutely. And that's exactly right. So take your time and relax. Don't beat yourself up, right? And that's kind of one of the things that I think a lot of guys, They get in the water and they hurry to get in the water, hurry to get out of the water, hurry to get in the water, hurry to get out of the water, right? Take your time. This is, I think David, who took my open water course, will tell you that I teach the number one rule of what I'm teaching is to do nothing and enjoy it. Focus on this square foot of ocean. And when you figure out the square foot of ocean, spend a few more minutes on it and then move to the next square foot of ocean. I promise you don't have to see the whole daggum lake, river, or ocean in one dive. It'll be there tomorrow. There's a lot of things to discover in just this square foot of ocean, right? So take your time. There's no hurry. That's one of the things I love about lake diving is we call it lake. My wife and I call it lake dive time. Lake dive time is about 20 minutes longer than anything else on the boat or anything else. We get down there, we get our easy chair, our little camp chairs all set up, and we get a yoga mat set up. We relax, we sit down, we talk about it for a minute, and we kind of get an idea what the dive's going to be. And then we start putting on our undergarments, and we put our dry suit on. We usually have the gear already set up, and we sit down for a minute, get our boots on, and we take our time. It really is. The only hard part is if you dive in Yellowstone Lake in a dry suit and you're that close, and there's a lot of tourists around. The tourists always ask the question as soon as you're zipped and you're in your BC and you're starting to walk to the lakes, what's that on your back? Are you scuba diving? What's that other thing? And it'll be 75, 80 degrees outside and the water's 45 degrees and you're standing there with your heated inner soles on and with 80 pounds of gear on, and they want to ask every question under the sun, or you're just getting out of the water and you're trying to get to the truck and you're like, and they want to, were you diving? What did you see? What did you do? You're like, my usual answer is, I will tell you everything you want to know in about 20 minutes. Or if they catch me before the dive, if you're back here in an hour and a half or 2 hours, I will tell you everything. I'll show you pictures. I'll tell you stories, but give me an hour and a half or 2 hours, whatever it is.
Pull a Bill Engvall and tell them, nope, there's a fire down there and I'm about to put it out.
Exactly.
Here's your sign.
Pretty much. So as we kind of go through this process, be aware that one of the cool opportunities for winter is ice diving. I love ice diving. It's a whole different experience, a whole different world. Went ice diving Sunday. Just went out. Unfortunately, the lake is too thin to walk on. So I just pushed in under the docks and went under the docks and did a 30-minute dive. Water temp was 36 degrees. So it was nice. It was kind of toasty and very enjoyable. It's fun to play with the ice. If you do go ice diving, I do teach an ice diving course, and I've got one scheduled for the 17th of February, which is a Saturday, in a few weeks. I'm hoping there's thick enough ice to ice dive on. But one of the interesting things about ice diving, if you do go, every single time, every single diver I ever go with, I tell them the same thing. The interesting things aren't at depth. The interesting things are at about 10 to 20 feet. You don't need to go deeper than 20 feet ice diving because the ice is the cool thing. The ley lines are the cool thing. That's all the neat stuff. If you go to 60 feet on an ice dive, it looks like sand. And the sand looks exactly as it did in June and July. There is no difference in ice sand or summer sand versus winter sand. It's still sand. The only difference is when you do find a crawdad, they're very lethargic. So if you get a chance, ice diving is amazing. This is me ice diving, and then this is Saturday, February 4th, but this was actually February 14th. My wife and I's first year together as a married couple. We went on February 13th and stayed in a dive hotel, and the February 14th we went ice diving together. So that was our Valentine's Day. Other normal husbands take their wives to dinner and buy them flowers and chocolates. I take my wife ice diving. So, and she loved it, by the way. She wanted to go 4 times. She was asking, hey, can we go again? Go again? So very fun stuff. Let's talk a little bit about pressure and Boyle's law. So as we kind of go through this, we talked a little bit about pressure and Boyle's law. We get the idea that at 1 atmosphere, we're going to talk surface ATA for a little bit, and then we're going to get in a little bit more depth of where we're at currently and get into the math. But surface ATA is 14.7 divided by 1. So it's 1 atmosphere, right? 33 feet is half the volume. And then 66 feet is 1/3 the volume, and 99 feet is 1/4 the volume. And the basic idea is it's not that the dynamic of the molecules get denser. It's that the space between them goes away. So the way I like to describe partial pressure is with my handy dandy blue sponges. Yes, this was in my wife's cabinet. I took it out and I cut them up, and I did replace her sponge. But as we look at this is great because it's the dark blue would be like oxygen, the light blue would be like nitrogen. So this is one molecule of air at the surface. As we get down to 33 feet, what ends up happening is we get compression. Now, there's still the same amount of air and oxygen in that. It's just that the space between the molecules is now gone. So we have an equivalent at 33 feet of 42% nitrogen, or 42% oxygen, and 158% nitrogen. So we lose the density between the molecules, and it becomes denser as we go through the process. Does everybody have a pretty good understanding of partial pressures?
The surface pressure at that would be at sea level, right? Not at
Yes, right now we're talking sea level. We will get into at atmospheric pressure and how that works and do that math. I've got 3 ways to do that, which make your life really easy. By the way, at the end of this, I will email everybody a study sheet as well, or not a study sheet, but a cheat sheet which will include my math as well. By the way, my math is unique. I sat down with all the different books, including the naval books from NATO, and I did the math on it for about a day, and I came up with some quick math for you to make your life easier. So as we kind of go through that, it just makes a good idea. So Justin, as we look at sea level, a flexible gas container is submerged at 33 feet. At that depth, it has a volume of 1 cubic foot. What will the volume of that container be if it is brought directly to the surface?
2 cubic feet.
Exactly. Ding, ding, ding. I always like to check to make sure we're on the idea. So dive planning. Hopefully you guys have a notebook, a pencil, paper, and your calculator. So this is the most complicated possible way to do it, but it works very, very accurate. So to figure your theoretical depth calculation, this is for your sea level equivalent depth. I'm going to call it SLED from this point out. Everybody got that? So the sample should be calculated at the sea level equivalent depth table using either atmosphere or hectopascal pressure units. Note that's the most common dive tables rely on minimum hydrostatic cap of 1.0 at the surface. Okay. Now there's a challenge with that, and it's a minor challenge. It's extremely minor. So the formula is going to be simple. It's going to be the equivalent depth equals the actual depth time P1 divided by P2. So example, if we have an equivalent depth of 49 feet seawater, we multiply that by 1 divided by 0.864. Now, here's where we got the 0.864. Let's see. I have a handy-dandy free app called Atmosphere, and it will tell me the atmospheric station pressure wherever I'm at, the closest atmospheric pressure. Now, we also have a base table that will give us at least a general idea what the atmospheric pressure should be in that area. So 0.864 is for 4,000 foot elevation. So find the equivalent depth at 49 feet seawater for 4,000 feet above sea level. So from our chart, and this is from the Navy dive tables, NOAA 4th edition manual, 0.864 is 4,000 feet. So 49 feet is times 1 divided by 0.0864. So that gives us a 1.157 difference. So we multiply 1.157 times 49 feet seawater equals 57 feet. If we were diving 4,000 foot elevation, a 49 foot dive would be equal to 57 feet. Does that make sense? Here's the challenge. This is a minor challenge, and my minor concern with this table is atmospheric pressure at sea level always 1?
No.
No. I've seen it 0.99. I've seen it 0.98. I've seen it 1.01. I've seen it varies, right? So the most accurate way to do this formula is going to be atmospheric pressure based upon sea level to the closest coast that you can get, divided by your actual atmospheric pressure will give you the most accurate. Now, the difference will be around 2 to 3 feet. Dave number 2, is 2 or 3 feet going to be that big a difference when it comes to most diving?
Dave number 2 would be me. Is that correct?
Yeah, who's Dave number 2?
Not Dave Gilmore, not Tim and Michelle, but and not Dave Kingsley, but the other Dave. Yes, you. Dave, what's your
Sorry,
last name?
I was talking on mute.
No worries.
For standard recreational diving, 2 to 3 feet wouldn't be that big of a deal. I don't
Absolutely.
think.
Dave, what's your last name real quick?
Herring, Herring, but I'll just change.
There we go. I got it. Already got you. That fast. Dave Herring. There we go. So yeah, for standard recreational diving, even in technical diving, unless you're getting some pretty advanced technical diving, you're going up to some pretty hardcore dives. 2 feet is not going to be that big a deal, right? Most dives I do in the 3 hour range with 1 to 2 accelerated deco gases. 2 feet isn't going to make or break the dive. And typically I've got that safety margin already built in. So as you start figuring it, it's easiest just to use 1 for your atmospheric pressure divided by your current atmospheric pressure of wherever you're at. Now, again, this altitude variation table is nice and simple. It's a great way to go. And this will be in your notes that I will send you guys as well. So simply enough, divide your atmospheric pressure divided by 1 will give you a new pressure differentiation. So this is going to be a 15.7% difference roughly from 49 feet, giving us 57 feet. Does that make sense? So overall, again, the easiest way to figure that out is to download the app. Altitude is what I use. It's free. I use a fair amount. So overall, it gives you that basic idea. So this is if we were using actual atmospheric pressure overall. So another quick way you can do this as well, you can actually go to Dive Buddy mobile calculator, and you can open the link here. And let's see here. Let me see if I was smart enough to.
So would an altimeter or barometer app be the same?
If it measures it in hectopascals, that's the biggest thing we're looking for is hectopascal measurement.
Okay.
Let's see. Share screen, entire screen is what I thought I was doing. Let's see. And here's the Dive Buddy app. This is free online. You'll have the link in there as well. So if I'm diving Yellowstone Lake, which is actually 7826, and I want to do a 100-foot dive, calculate. Your theoretical depth is 130 feet sea level. The depth of your safety shop should be 12 feet. The atmospheric pressure will be 0.7477. And this is a free app. The challenge is you may have noticed is that places like Yellowstone, the internet doesn't work as wonderfully as you might hope. Or in Leadville. How's the internet in Leadville? They got good Wi-Fi there?
Even the internet at home in Conifer is not that great. So
Our cell phones don't work at the house.
yeah, our cell phones don't work at the house.
Other ways you can do this, Subsurface is one of my favorite dive planning apps. I use it quite a bit for my technical diving, but sea level dives are not sea level, but for recreational dives, it works great as well. The sled equivalent depth table, this will be in your notes as well. There's a quick table. So if you're 4,000 feet and you're doing a 60-foot dive, it's equal to a 70-foot dive. If you're doing an 8,000 foot elevation dive to 100 feet, it's going to be 140. It gives you at least a quick reference as well. Who wants the simple math? Anybody like the simple math? How about 3.5% gain for every 1,000 foot? You think you can remember that?
I like that.
Absolutely. So I gave you the hardest way first, a little bit less complicated, and then finally the simplest way last. So if you can remember 3.5% for every 1,000 foot gained and 2 hours of surface interval before you do a dive for every 1,000 foot gained, you're going to be about right. So simple enough. Does that make sense, guys?
Yep, makes sense. Me.
Now, the interesting part for me is why. I like to know the why. Why is it that we're dealing with a sea level equivalent depth? And the basic reason is actually pretty interesting in that while water is going to weigh at 8,000 foot, water weighs the same as it does at 2,000 feet as it does at sea level, right? A gallon of water is going to be X amount of weight, right? So the question becomes, why do we have a theoretical depth for altitude? Kind of
Because
weird,
you need
huh?
to take into account the altitude and how thin the atmosphere is when you're at altitude.
Absolutely.
You're closer to the vacuum of space.
I like that one. So absolutely. So the idea is once I go down, I'm dealing with the same amount of atmospheric pressure. The challenge is we're dealing with the residual nitrogen. As I come up, once I break that plane of zero water, I'm all of a sudden ascending quite a bit of difference, right? If I'm at 1,000 feet, I'm ascending 5 feet higher once I come out of the water automatically, right? If I'm just at 1,000, if I'm 2,000 feet, I'm 3.5% deeper and farther up. So as I come out of the water column, I'm coming to a lighter atmospheric pressure. Because I'm coming to a lighter atmospheric pressure, it's the same as ascending 3.5% more once I hit that zero plane of the water. Does that make sense?
So it's
So
all the zero plane to the water. It's not necessarily that. So
there's no more weight
the
to
reason
the
I'm
water.
asking that. Okay, but the reason I'm asking it is if you're at, say, 20 feet and your equivalent depth then is, I think on some of that chart it said 25 feet.
Mhm.
Does that mess with like your partial pressure of oxygen if you're doing a 100% oxygen bottle at 20 feet?
That's a great question.
Your limit's kind of 21 feet, right, on your 1.6?
It's a great question, and no, it doesn't. Your partial pressure and the weight of the water was going to be the same.
Okay, so this is mainly just to account for that large jump right at the end when you break the surface, not okay.
You got it.
So
That's
your
exactly
MODs are still going to be the same for your gases.
mods are the same, partial
Okay.
pressure is the same, and that's a great question, Tim.
Okay.
By the way, and it's something I debated for a long time until I finally talked to a hyperbaric doctor to clarify for me as well, so I could get it straight in my head. So it's a yes and no question, and it's a slightly no question, yes question. But it's a mostly no question. So it's a 95% no question. It doesn't change it, and a 5% yes. So here's why. Here's the interesting part. The problem with it is there's a point of equilibration. So you get used to, say you're at, I don't know, you're at 4,000 foot elevation. It's 0.85 atmospheric pressure. So you have a 15% difference between that and a reduction of atmospheric pressure, right? My brain kicks into a hyperbaric nature where my brain's used to that 15% less. So it's oxygenating my body based upon that 15% less. Okay. So I'm slightly hypoxic. And so my body builds an acclimation to that slightly hypoxic nature. So we have a slight increase in sensitivity to carbon dioxide buildup, hypercapnia, as well as a slight more sensitivity to increased partial pressure of oxygen. But in terms of CNS and pulmonary oxygen toxicity, no, it doesn't cause an issue. We have an increased sensitivity to it. Does that make sense? But it's very light. It's definitely something you will notice, especially when you start getting in deep, when you start dealing with hypercapnia. But it's again slight. So as you work through that process, just be aware of that, and that you're going to have a slight more sensitivity. But in terms of, like I said, for CNS toxicity and pulmonary toxicity, as well as narcosis level, there's going to be no difference between that. So, Good question, though. Great question.
So effectively, probably something slightly easier to understand is you could basically compare the jump in pressure difference when you get out of the water at altitude, kind of similar to an explosive decompression on an airplane. Kind of think the Alaska Airlines that just had the emergency door plug blow out. They experienced at 16,000 feet, they went from, probably 8,000 feet of cabin pressure to 16,000 feet of cabin pressure. So there's an 8,000 foot difference in cabin pressure in just mere seconds. You could probably make a correlation between the two in a kind of semi-similar fashion, probably.
Absolutely. I might make that correlation that they went from zero or from maybe 4,000 foot to 8,000 foot, right? Pressurization. And you definitely feel that, right? I've had that happen where there was a light depressurization of the cabin, but it wasn't explosive in that nature. But you feel that. You feel your ears pop. You feel lightheaded. You feel dizzy, right? A sudden change in altitude pressure. Well, it won't be explosive, I think, is an overstatement and definitely an overreach, but it's not far off either. So I appreciate where you're going with that, David, because I think you're right on track and you're getting it. And that's the important part. So overall, just to kind of reiterate, let's see. David Gilmore, a flexible container is submerged to 34 feet fresh water at an altitude of 3,000 feet. At that depth, it has a volume of 1 cubic feet. What will the volume be when it reaches the surface?
Double that.
Will it just be double?
Well, if it's at 1 atmosphere, 2.21. Sorry.
Yep. So remember, we're dealing with theoretical depth plus the elevation change, atmospheric change because of the elevation. So because of theoretical depth, now we have a gas-filled cylinder is going to be 2.21 cubic feet. So discussion. What's the most accurate way to determine SLED, the sea level equivalent depth, guys?
That'd be the formula with an actual barometric pressure at surface, right?
Absolutely. Now, how do you think this might affect your ascent rate?
You should definitely take more time that last little bit. I mean, you should always take more time with the last 33 feet or so because you're actually doubling your gas volume at that. But you should take even more because there's that last little pop at the end in the case of altitude diving.
Good job, Tim. How do you think this affects your safety stop, Dave Herring? Sorry.
You should probably extend your safety stop a little bit or calculate how long it should be. Am I talking on mute?
Nope, I got you.
No, you should adjust it based upon the depth that you go down to, shouldn't you?
Absolutely. So you're going to run a SLED depth, a sea level equivalent depth on your safety stop. So if you're used to doing a 20-foot safety stop and you're at 8,000 foot elevation, you're going to change that to 13 feet, right? Roughly 12, 13 feet to cover the same depth and get that same dynamic of off-gassing. Longer safety stops, I'm all in favor for as well. Getting that good off-gassing as well. Justin, would there be any additional considerations for traveling after altitude diving?
Yes, there would be, especially if you were going to gain any altitude, like climbing over the Yellowstone crater, climbing over that pass, because you're going to gain what is it? Like 1,300 feet, depending on which way you go out. If you go out the way I would come out, you're going to gain about 1,300 feet, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you want to take that extra time, right? Make sure to get that good off-gassing going. That's going to be one of our big consideration is that off-gassing. All right. So from the SSI altitude pressure variation table, what is the atmospheric pressure at 4,000 foot? Michelle, I haven't heard you talking a little bit.
0.864.
0.864 is exactly right. Bingo, bingo. And finally, a diver plans a dive at 4,000 foot to 70 feet fresh water. What is his sea level equivalent depth or SLED? David Gilmore.
Okay, so he's at 4,000 feet.
He's at 4,000 feet.
And he's going to be diving at 70 feet?
Yep.
What is his SLED?
What's his SLED?
I'm not sure.
So there's a couple ways to figure that. You can certainly either do the math, or the simplest one is 3.5% for every 1,000 foot. That's the simplest math I can give you.
So we'll multiply 4,000 times 3.5%.
So 4 times 3.5%, yeah, would be 14%.
Right, 14%.
So 14% deeper than 70 feet is
9.8 feet. No, must divide 70 by 14.
yep. So 1.14 times 70.
That doesn't seem to be coming out of the chart.
80 feet.
80 feet. Yeah. So 4 times 3.5 is 14%. So 14% deeper. So 1.14 would be times 70 should be 79.8.
Got it.
Round that up to 80.
So we
You
have
can
a
also
question.
Sure.
The altitude sea level equivalent depth table in the SSI altitude diving table says 90 feet.
Let's take a look. 4,000.
I came up with 81 feet. 81.01.
70. Let's take a look. 70. It does say 90. There is a typo on there on the SSI app. That is absolutely a typo. I can tell you right now.
Yeah,
Okay.
because the next column over 5,000 feet is again 90. 6,000 feet again is 90. And then
Yep, there's
7,000
a
feet is
typo on
90.
that. Good catch. That's from the SSI. So that is absolutely a typo.
So does he get a free banner or sticker or something?
Absolutely. 3 stickers in the mail. So if you use the 3.5%, and that is absolutely a typo. I'm going to go through and redo that table and I'll for you guys as well. So good job, because I copied that straight over. So 80 feet is going to be what we're looking for. Good job.
So
Good.
just on that math again, we're taking 14% of the altitude that we're diving at,
We're adding 14%. Yeah.
adding 14% of the altitude that we're diving at, and it's 14% because we're at because we dropped 4,000 feet.
We came up 4,000 feet from sea level.
Came up 4,000 feet.
So for
Okay.
every 1,000 foot of gain, we add 3.5% to the depth. Is the easiest math I can give you.
So that's because it's 4,000 feet. That's 4 times 3.5, which is 14.
Correct.
And then we multiply that times 70.
And that should be 79.8.
So 70 times 1.14, 79.8.
Easy
So
enough.
if you change this to 5,000 feet, you're coming up 5,000 feet, then that number from 80, it'll change to approximately 84, rounding up.
Yep.
Because then you're in the next column.
So it's 17.5% difference. So 1.175 times 70 equals 82.25. And I will be working on that, reworking that table for SSI and sending that over to the SSI people as well, because that's BS that the table's wrong. You guys are the first person. I taught this class a lot, and the first people to catch that. So good job. I knew there was a typo in it. I hadn't gone through it and did find it though. So good job on finding that error. Absolutely. All right. So let's see. I'm going to skip that. We've already talked about that. So one of the things we deal a lot with in altitude diving, believe it or not, is Henry's Law. Henry's Law.
I have one question.
Sure. Go ahead, Justin. I'm sorry.
How much does density altitude have to do with our calculations? The reason is because, like, for instance, here at 4,000 feet, I've seen density altitude, and this really affects aircraft. I've seen density altitude of 8,000 feet. Now pressure change is minimal. It will mess with. That's why aircraft have to readjust their altimeters so they have the accurate distance to the ground. It can mess with an aircraft as much as say 20 feet of atmosphere.
Sure.
So is this why you're saying at sea level you've seen that fluctuation in the readings for where you were at closest to you?
Absolutely. So what you're talking about is not so much density, but your atmospheric pressure, which is developed by weather patterns. And absolutely, on any given day. So when I go out and dive Tech and Ryrie, which is at 4,900 to 5,100 foot, depending upon which station you look at, I usually use 5,000 foot elevation, but I go by atmospheric pressure more than I go into anything. So as I'm doing my technical dive planning for a 3-hour dive, I use the atmospheric pressure to do that for the day that I'm diving. And I try and do it within an hour or two of when I'm diving to get the most accurate reading so that I can figure out what my actual decompression time is going to be based upon my gas.
Okay.
I've seen it swing. I mean, I've seen a big storm out there where it'd be 832, and I've seen a bright, sunny, warm day where it'd be 87. I mean, you start looking at that. I mean, that's could be 4 to 5% difference in terms of overall density, not density, but the atmospheric pressure. And when you start talking about 4%, that could be 4 minutes to 5 minutes on a deco stop.
Yeah. Okay. So that density altitude to a degree, how warm or how cool the atmosphere is, changing that air pressure does affect the calculations.
It does. Absolutely. So 3.5% will get you in the ballpark, but when you start getting into hardcore, when you're doing technical diving, make sure you have the accurate atmospheric pressure for where you're diving at.
So how do you get that if you're not there?
I have an app that I use, atmospheric pressure, and that on my phone, and I make sure to pull that up as best I can. With Yellowstone, I do the best judgment I can, and I always add just a little bit of extra depth as well. So I make sure to add additional safety margin if I'm not able to get an accurate pressure reading for where I'm at. So if I'm doing a 3-hour at Yellowstone, I add a little safety margin because sometimes I'm not able to get the actual atmospheric pressure for where I'm at to make my dive plan.
So is that data coming from NOAA?
It comes sort of through NOAA. It comes from the weather stations that are closest.
Okay.
Luckily, by the lake, there's a weather station.
Probably honestly comes through the FAA because they monitor that stuff very closely.
Yeah, there's at Yellowstone Lake, at the Lake Lodge, there's a weather station there. So usually I can go by the Lake Lodge and I can get the current atmospheric pressure, and it'll give me a good idea where I'm at. And so that's typically what I do, but sometimes I don't have that access, so I work a little bit safe. But the 3.5% will get you absolutely within the ballpark, and get you a lot closer than without. So does that answer those questions?
Yeah, thanks.
No problems. So as we kind of move on, I want to talk a little bit about Henry's Law. And Henry's Law is fairly complex, and it's 14 pages long kind of deal. It's not really that long, but I feel like it is when you start getting into his 18th century doublespeak. But Henry's Law basically says at a constant temperature, the amount of a given gas dissolved in a volume of liquid is directly proportional to the partial pressure of the gas in equilibrium with that liquid at a constant temperature. So the law essentially has two parts, and it's as the pressure increases, the solubility of the gas in the liquid increases. The second part is the temperature increases, the solubility of the gas liquid increases as well. So it's interesting to note on this that the cooler the liquid, the more gas that can be absorbed into the liquid, and as it warms up, it escapes from it as well. So two things work in this. As we're at the higher altitudes, we tend to have less oxygen, so our cardiovascular system is working faster. That's part one. So as our cardiovascular system is working faster and our heart's beating more and we're fighting to get that good oxygen, we're on-gassing nitrogen faster. The partial pressure of the nitrogen is going into our systems quicker, right? As the gas gets colder, it absorbs more easily into the liquid as well and into our tissue compartments as well. So one of the things that we need to be aware of is as we're at this higher altitude, we're working harder for that same gas. As we're working harder for that same gas, we're absorbing nitrogen more quickly. So be aware of that. As we get colder, or we're diving colder and breathing colder liquids or colder gases, we're also dealing with that same thing. The partial pressure of that gas absorbs into the liquid, the blood, if you will, into the arterial network. It absorbs more quickly and more easily into our tissues. So be aware, cold, more nitrogen buildup. Faster heart rate, more nitrogen buildup. So a couple things to be aware of. Ascent rates should be reduced by about 5 feet per minute or more after you go over 4,000 feet elevation to allow for the colder water. I have yet to dive a really, really warm 85-degree lake over 4,000 feet. I'm waiting for that day. I'm praying for that day. I take that back. I have. That's not true. Belmont Hot Springs is 85 degrees, but the only way to get past 29 feet at Belmont Hot Springs is to bring a shovel. So be aware, hot springs, that's a different thing, right? Now, safety stops should be adjusted to the correct theoretical depth based upon the dive site. And safety stop times should be increased by about 20% for every 4,000 foot of elevation gain to allow for the larger atmospheric change at the surface. We already talked about that a little bit, but just be aware, add some safety stop time because you're going to go through that, as David Kingsley said, that kind of explosive decompression. So allow yourself that time to allow the elasticity of your tissues to be affected on that. Does that make sense?
So you don't start adjusting your safety stop time until you hit 4,000 feet?
About 4,000 feet was where I'd encourage actually making a nice adjustment to that as well. Now, David, when we do Belmont, we probably won't be doing safe stops because most of your dives will be at 20 feet.
Right.
But if you were diving the crater, for example, I would definitely encourage adding a little bit of safety stop time and a slower ascent. Oddly enough, if you are diving the crater, next time you go, read the safety information on the back of the form that you sign saying that you'll be a safe diver. One of the things that you are agreeing to is that you will agree to reduce your ascent rate by 5 feet and increase your safety stop. So it's, I know Craig pretty well, and he and I had a long discussion about that. So with the warmer water, it's probably not needed, but why not have it and be a little safer, right? So as we kind of go through this, we've talked a lot about this, and I'm going to put my pictures up because I like my pictures. One of the things we want to make sure we're adding to this process, let's see, there we go, is the effects of altitude on atmospheric pressure, the role of atmospheric pressure on dive tables. We need to include the benefits of using a dry suit. One of the things that you guys are dealing with in this colder water is you're going to get cold. It's definitely not to your advantage to get cold. You can increase your chance of DCS by a factor of 5 by doing that. So making sure that you have a good dry suit, you know how to use that dry suit. There's me and 2 of my students with dry suits on over at Ryrie. And then just for fun, this was yesterday at Ryrie where I was doing some ice diving. So that's me holding a large chunk of ice over top of my head. But a nice dry suit, there's a lot of benefits to them. Right? It keeps your hands warm. It keeps your body warm, but it also helps you prevent from getting things like hypothermia, which is absolutely a fact. And remember, hypothermia is cumulative. So the more you dive in cold water, the more you're going to build that up. But it also helps you keep from getting DCS as well because you're staying warmer through the process. And one of the things that you will realize in diving high altitude and cold is most dives will end because of thermal discomfort more than they will because of dive time. Another thing to be aware of, and it's really just a great idea if you're diving wintertime or high altitude, get yourself a shelter for dressing before and after a dive. One of the things that Nikki and I have discovered is we have an ice tent. I bought it from Amazon. It cost me $250. In fact, over at Sportsman's, they're on sale for $180 right now. And they're very slick. We're having a crap ice season this year, so they're all on sale. So if you need an ice tent, go to Sportsman's. But one of the great things about an ice tent we've discovered is that even without a heater in it, It's usually 15 to 20 degrees warmer in the tent than it is outside, just from getting us out of the weather, out of the wind. And that black roof does a really nice job of adding thermal warmth as well. So getting a shelter, they're cheap. They're inexpensive as well. Another key thing, make sure you have warm liquid. Keep yourself warm from the inside as well. And then as you get into cold water at high altitude, one of the biggest problems, one of the scariest things and biggest health concerns that most people have diving altitude is hydration. Believe it or not, more people get dehydrated at high altitude and cold than they do in low altitude and warm. I think it's partially because it's cold. You don't think about the water. You think about it when you're getting warm and you're sweating. You're like, I better drink some water. I better get hydrated. But as you got to go through this process, I think we forget about it more often than not. So make sure you're staying well hydrated through that process. Now, another consideration, this is a little bit outside of scope, but I like to go through it, is the idea of gas densities. Now, understanding and applying gas density is definitely a huge factor, and it's something that's new to this class, but it's not new to my other classes. So overall, what is work of breathing? Who's got that for me?
Work of breathing. How hard you work to breathe?
Justin?
Partly it would be more than just how hard it is for you to breathe, but it would be how much oxygen is in each breath that you're taking and how efficiently your body is able to pull that gas out at higher altitude. The air in general is thinner, so each breath has less oxygen. So you're working harder to maintain your blood oxygen levels.
Yeah, absolutely. So work of breathing is an integral of pressure as a function of volume that's used to measure the effort required to breathe. Now, high work of breathing means it takes more effort measured in energy, and typically they measure that in joules. This is the only place I know that we use joules. I am not an electrician, or work with that, but it's typically measured by joules. Now, it's the work of air energy to draw breath measured in liters. Now, high work of breathing results in an increase of carbon dioxide production, and that carbon dioxide increase can result in hypercapnia, narcosis, loss of consciousness, among other things. Pretty interesting. Now, gas density is measured in mass per volume. And the way we measure this is in grams per liter. Now, high gas density means a given volume of a gas weight is takes more effort to move, resulting in a higher work of breathing. Increased gas density also skews the pressure gradient between breathed arterial CO2, resulting in further decreasing CO2 or carbon dioxide off-gassing efficiency, and recurring system that results in further complications. So as we start building up that carbon dioxide in our system, it becomes a real challenge. Now, they did a study, the University of California, University of England, Manchester, as well as University of New Zealand, Auckland, got together and they studied this. And they determined that a maximum gas density of 5.2 grams per liter with a hard maximum of 6.2 grams per liter is the best way to go. Now, working with both open circuit and rebreather divers, Anthony Mitchell found that gas densities near that 6 grams per liter mark significantly increased the risk of dangerous carbon dioxide retention during dives, resulting in their test subjects failing more than half of their attempted dives and experiencing issues at more than 3 times the rate of divers using 1 gram per liter less. Their takeaway was simple. From the research was that the ideal gas density was 5.2 grams per liter, which is equivalent to 102 feet seawater and a hard maximum of on air, or a hard maximum of 6.2 grams per liter, which is an equivalent of air at 125 feet. So the hard max 125 feet is 6.2 grams per liter. Now, it's interesting to kind of go through the process and learn that, for example, helium has a weight of 0.179 grams per liter. Nitrogen has a weight of 1.251 grams per liter. Oxygen is 1.428 grams per liter. So oxygen is heavier than nitrogen. Kind of interesting. So the air we breathe right now is 1.293 grams per liter. That's the common weight where we're at. No matter where we're at, that's the weight. It's a constant weight. I weigh 100, or I shouldn't say, I weigh 220 pounds at Yellowstone, and I weigh 220 pounds in Fort Lauderdale. Unfortunately, I wish that I would weigh less when I got higher, but it just doesn't seem to work that way. So be aware, at 100 feet seawater, you're breathing at 5.2 grams per liter. At 125 feet, you're breathing at 125 grams per liter. Now, why is that important to know?
Well, that's my question. So how does that apply to what we're doing if the optimum is 5 grams and we're only at 1 point something?
So right at what we're breathing at the surface is 1.29 grams per liter. But if we get to 100 feet seawater, that's equal to 5.2 grams per liter, the maximum amount that we should be breathing. At 125 feet, it's equal to 6.2 grams per liter, the maximum, causing a heavy gas retention of carbon dioxide.
It's one of the reasons why Henry went to, which is in his rebreather, he switches gases because nitrogen at the depth that he was going was a very, very dense gas, and he would have exceeded it was like 7,000 kPascals, or whatever that equivalent number was for the 6.2 grams per liter. Nitrogen becomes too heavy, so you have to use a different gas.
Yep.
That
even
was
helium too heavy.
Yeah.
So even helium's too heavy. Justin?
At 100 feet, you're taking in 5 breaths equivalent with each breath that you are at the surface. So you just in general, because you're cramming so much more air into your lungs with each breath, the air is just denser, it's heavier.
Absolutely. So as it gets heavier, it starts building up a heavier carbon dioxide retention, hypercapnia, right? So as divers continue to go deeper, and an understanding of this must be realized, deeper dives must contain lesser and lesser effort because that carbon dioxide buildup and that heavy gas, it's not really heavy, but that dense gas going in makes it much more difficult to breathe, causing a much heavier workload on our cardiovascular system. According to Dan, last year, 58% of divers' deaths were caused or cardiac related. Justin?
It increases, you can think of it as at 100 feet, you have 5 times the amount of dead air space in your lungs. With each breath, you have 5 times the amount of air that never left your lower lungs. So that lower lung area that at the surface does get circulated out, that air is never leaving, that gas volume is never leaving. So as your cardiovascular system is working, it's just dumping more and more carbon dioxide into that space. That's one of the reasons why these snorkel masks, all-in-ones, are dangerous. And you have people that are snorkeling and then they just pass out because they have that. It's actually a much larger dead airspace where even though they're breathing, that airspace is not being exchanged with fresh air.
Absolutely. So we kind of continue the process. I'm going to tie this all together in just a moment. The statistics are this. Dives with less than 6 grams per liter had less than a 10% failure rate. Dives with more than 6 grams per liter had an immediate jump to more than 40% failure rate. It's huge. And it's mostly because of the hypercapnia, or the buildup of carbon dioxide in the system. So hypercapnia is when you have high levels of carbon dioxide in your blood, and carbon dioxide is a waste product that your body gets rid of when you exhale. If you can't get rid of it, it can build up in your blood. Now, other interesting things happen when you start building into hypercapnia. Your brain freaks out, and it starts trying to force additional oxygen into the system as well, and trying to pass the blood barrier, the hemoglobin barrier. So interesting things happen, and it screws up a lot of systems. So as we kind of look through this, I want to put this out there. So hypercapnia looks like this: lightheadedness, euphoria, slowed response, a feeling of well-being, increased judgmental airiness or giddiness, deterioration of fine dexterity, fixation on ideas, time distortion, deterioration of multitask reasoning, numbness, tingling, and it just keeps going down. Confusion, semi-conscious, distorted memory, disorientation, paranoia, anxiety, shortness of breath. Do those signs and symptoms sound like anything else that you guys have ever heard of?
Sounds like someone's drunk.
Could be. What's another symptom? We talk a lot about this in diving. After people pass that 60-foot mark, there's another thing that pops up that we're like, oh, watch out. Narcosis. So I went ahead and oh, sorry, I got to share my screen again. So I went ahead and put together hypercapnia versus nitronarcosis. Anybody notice anything fairly similar here?
Basically identical.
Coincidence?
No.
So as you guys go through this process, I want you to think about that as you guys are doing these dives, right? You're doing 60, 80, 90, 100 feet in a lake at a high altitude. You will be more sensitive to things like nitronarcosis and hypercapnia, and the difference in gas densities. Because you've been breathing at a lighter atmosphere, at light atmospheric pressure, your brain is used to a specific amount of oxygenation and how it's processing that oxygenation through the hemoglobin barrier in your lung structure from the alveoli through, right? So you will be far more sensitive to things like nitronarcosis and hypercapnia. You'll be more sensitive to increased gas densities. So I encourage you, please be very careful as you start doing these deeper dives, because your sensitivity to things like hypercapnia and narcosis are substantially more than what you're accustomed to. Build up your comfort level. Don't just go out one day and say, I'm going to do a 130-foot dive in this lake because I'm trained to 130 feet. Build up your time to go to that depth. Do your 80-foot dive. Do your 90-foot dives. Do your 100-foot dives. Just don't suddenly go out and say, I'm going to do a 130-foot dive, because already you're building up and going into those dangerous zones. But even more so, you're building into that dynamic of which really is more hypercapnia than it is narcosis. But there's been plenty of times that somebody has been diagnosed with having nitronarcosis that in truth had hypercapnia. They're very interchangeable, and hypercapnia absolutely is a strong predisposer to creating nitronarcosis, and the other way around as well. So be aware as you start doing these deeper depths. Gosh, that's a hard one to say. Say that one 5 times fast. Realize that this gas density means something. Be careful. I think that's enough of that. We should all be dry suit certified at this point. As you guys got to go through this process, every diver should do a good pre-dive check. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes just doesn't catch everything at altitude, right? As you're starting to do these high altitude dives, you're going to be away from your dive shop. You're going to be away from everything. So one of the things I would encourage you to do strongly is before you leave home, make sure you're checking your regulators. Put them on your cylinders. Make sure they function as advertised. Take them over and make sure you're doing a good service at your dive shop, and make sure your intermittent pressure is at 140 psi, right? Coming out of the first stage, that it's not rising as it goes through. You could absolutely set up a quick intermittent pressure gauge. It's pretty easy to set up. I want to say it costs you about $150, $200 from Dive Right In. And you can set that up at home, and you can check your intermittent pressure out of a first stage pretty easily. But check your stuff. The last thing you always want to do is show up at a dive site that's 3.5 hours away from anything that you're going to get to, and have a regulator fail and have to try and figure out either how to rebuild it or suck it up, right? So make sure you guys check those kind of things. Don't be afraid to check your dry suit inflators. Check everything and make sure everything is working as advertised and as it should be. Also be aware as you start going to these higher altitudes, colder weather definitely becomes a factor. A great example of that, I was diving the lake the week between Christmas and New Year's, or not the lake, the river here. and it was about 5 degrees outside, and the river temperature was 31 degrees. I threw my twin sets in the back of my truck in the morning and forgot about them, and until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when we drove over there, and we go over there, my emergency dump valve was frozen shut with big things of ice, and so was my inflator. So we had to run warm water over it to make sure that it all operated correctly. So keeping your gear inside nice warm areas, definitely to your advantage. It's a pain in the butt when you get to the water and your inflator is froze shut. I've had that happen numerous times. A lot of times you can stick it in the water and keep actuating, and it'll defrost in the water because the water is usually warmer than the air temperature. But be aware that's absolutely something that happens. As you're diving altitude, bring a spare regulator. I usually bring at least one first and second stage spare, sometimes two, with me to make sure that I've got something that happens. I have had regulators go bad on me as well. So redundancy is definitely a big thing. How could a redundant equipment help you in high altitude before a dive?
Could you repeat that question?
How could redundant equipment help you in a high altitude dive before diving?
Well, you should be checking your gear before you dive, and if you find a failure, then you have a backup.
Okay.
You don't have to scrub the whole trip.
Exactly. Simple enough. So before a dive, having some redundant equipment is definitely to your advantage. Something happens, right? Having a good save-a-dive can. How about during the dive? That's maybe even more important. Tim, what do you think? How would redundant equipment during your dive be beneficial on a high-altitude dive?
Well, self-rescue is always the best option. So, I mean, your solo dive training or your tech training or whatever teaches redundancy in equipment, because especially colder water or deeper water, you run risks on reg fails and stuff like that, free flows and whatnot, and stuff that you need to take care of. But you're also, because you're maybe not quite exactly but similar to a soft sealing of like a deco situation, being in deco, needing to do deco stops. Because you can't really pop to the surface quite as fast because of the altitude issues, you almost have a soft sealing similar to when you run into decompression procedures. So
absolutely. So we kind of go through this, some options on redundant systems. I am not a fan of the single cylinder Y setup or H setup. It's just not my favorite. It's certainly better than nothing, but I have discovered that if a regulator is going to go out on an H cylinder, it's going to be on your primary, not on your secondary. And once you close this valve down, it usually cuts both of them off. So it's really no point in it, right? You get a small chance of a better dynamic, at least on a Y. If you shut one valve off, it doesn't shut the other valve off. I'm still not a fan of either, because you're still running from the same tank. And if there's a catastrophic gas failure, reaching your stupid arm back there to try and get it off is not the easiest thing in the world, especially in a freaking dry suit. Running valve drills on twin sets in a dry suit is my least favorite thing in the entire world to do. It's one of the reasons I dive side mount. But others, so a better solution, in my opinion, I'm not a fan of putting it on your back either. It screws up your buoyancy, in my opinion, as well as if there was a problem and you hit that, or it was bubbling and leaking, you have no way of checking it. In my opinion, the most ideal situation for a second cylinder, a redundant gas source, is going to be either true twin sets and or a safety cylinder, a pony bottle of some kind. So real quick, what's the difference between a pony bottle, a deco bottle, and a stage bottle? Anybody know?
Your pony bottle is smaller.
Is it? Tim?
Your pony would be travel gas. Your deco bottle is going to be probably high oxygen for say 50 to 100% oxygen for your 70 feet to down to 20 feet deco stuff. and then your, what was the other one? Stage bottle is going to be another travel to a certain depth. Yeah, your top.
Drop it and you pick it up on your way back out and switch back to
there you go. Michelle's got it. So the difference between a stage and a deco bottle and a pony bottle is a stage and a deco bottle are designed to be used during a dive. A pony bottle is not. A pony bottle is your emergency gas that if you use it, that's the end of your dive. You're carrying it as a backup only. A deco bottle is designed to be used during a dive and actively in some way. And it doesn't have to be that high. I mean, I've got students where I've had them use a 40% deco blend. You can certainly do that, right? The difference between a deco bottle and a stage bottle is a stage bottle is a deco bottle that you want to leave somewhere. I'm going to stage it somewhere because I don't want to carry. Carrying, I don't know if you've ever carried 6 tanks, but it's a freaking nightmare. Anytime I can drop a couple of those bottles off somewhere because I'm going to come back to them, I absolutely positively will do that every single time. In fact, if I could drop 4 bottles on a 6-bottle load, I will absolutely do that because those tanks, I don't care if they're in the water or not, they're still a pain in the butt to carry. They're weighty, they're limited in mobility. So that's the real difference. As you start thinking about a pony bottle to carry along for emergency, it's not something you should be using during the dive. If you're using it during the dive, there's a problem, and you're going into a more advanced kind of diving. So my encouragement, if you're going to carry a pony bottle, you carry it on your left-hand side, and you carry it directly underneath so you can see the process. Once you get it, you turn it on, you prime it, you test it, check the pressure, and then you turn it off, but you don't take the pressure out of it. And the idea is once it's charged, ready to go, all you have to do in an emergency is turn it back on, but you'll at least have 1 or 2 breaths ready to go. And if it's turned off, it can't accidentally bubble off. It'll always be ready for you. You should do the same thing with stage bottles and deco bottles as well. But the difference between, like I said, a pony bottle and a stage and deco bottle is a pony bottle shouldn't be used during the dive because that's not what it's really there for. But again, I like to put mine underneath my arm on my left-hand side so I can see it and I know what's going on. It's a little bit more protected and it's ready in case of emergency. Another solution, certainly twin sets or side mount is a great way to go. This is my twin set setup, and this is me diving side mount as well. It's having 2 completely redundant tanks. As we're diving twin sets, though, if you have a gas malfunction on one side, reaching back and finding that stinking isolator and turning the gas off is definitely a pain in a dry suit for sure. Other things to be aware of: cold water rated regulators. These are the extreme cold weather EMTXRs from Apex. They're the military grade. I dive the one step below this, the XTX, and I've never had a problem. I also dive the Hollis 200LX, which are equally rated. But one of the things to be aware of as the gas is coming out of the cylinder, it's coming out 20 to 30 degrees cooler. If you're diving water that's 40 degrees, as the gas comes out, it's going to be 20 to 30 degrees cooler. The last time my wife and I ever did this, and made the mistake of doing this, we'll never do it again, of using a safety second to fill an SMB, a DSMB. We were in Yellowstone Lake and the water temperature was about 34 degrees. We'd found a new spire. We were doing some map diving. It was towards the end of a dive, and she pulled out her safety second, pulled out the SMB, and she stuck it under the bottom. This is a bunch of years ago, so it's a long time ago, but stuck it under there to fill it up. It only inflated for about 20 seconds, 15 seconds at best. In that 15 seconds that it went, this was a good Ziegel regulator, safety second, and it froze to the open. So be aware that as you're going through, you need to make sure that you're diving cold weather ready gear, but also take a few steps of additional planning as you go through things as well. So for example, whenever I fill a DSMB in a lake or cold water, I never use a different air source to do it. I don't break my regulator open. I don't use a safety second. I don't take my regulator out of my mouth. I'm already breathing normally and gas is exhausting. So what I do is I stick 2 thumbs in the bottom of my SMB. I turn my head to the side and I just breathe naturally and let the bubbles do what they're doing. That way I'm not increasing the flow rate out. I take my time and I fill it up that way. It works really, really well. But just be aware that cold water regulators and how you do things in cold water are definitely to your advantage as well as you're doing this. Another thing to be aware of is what kind of computer are you diving? If you're diving something like a Suunto, this is a Suunto EN Core. be aware it doesn't automatically correct for altitude. That's kind of a big deal. You have to manually correct for altitude. If you're going to dive a computer, be aware of how it adjusts to altitude. Also be aware it's not taking into consideration the amount of nitrogen you're off-gassing as you rise to that altitude. It's taking into account the nitrogen at the current altitude level that you're at as well. So just be aware of that as well. Other things to be aware of, visibility considerations. I have yet to be, well, I take that back. I have been in a lake that had 100 feet of viz. Yellowstone Lake, or not Yellowstone Lake, Redfish Lake in central Idaho is beautiful. 100 feet of viz. Nothing to see, lots and lots of sand, but beautiful viz. Most of your viz in lakes is going to look more like this. I think that's my blushing bride in Ryrie. So be aware that visibility concerns are definitely something to be aware of. Surface swim is another big deal. One of the things that happens that's very common if you're not really great at navigating and you don't ascend close to shore, you're going to have to do a surface swim. For example, Yellowstone Lake, typically it is a quarter of a mile swim out to where we dive. And then one of the sites we go to is a half a mile swim out there. So typically we do most of our deco and safety stop in motion while we swim toward shore to get closer to shore. But the problem is as you pop to shore or pop up and you have to do that surface swim, all of a sudden now air cannot get into the feet of your dry suit and your feet will get cold. So you definitely want to try and surface as close to where you're exiting as humanly possible. It's definitely one of the things as you're working harder, you're off-gassing nitrogen more. As you're swimming and your feet are getting cold, that's not fun either. Environmental concerns. One of the interesting things with diving lakes is when the wind hits really fast, it doesn't make nice, even ocean waves. Right, you get in the ocean, you get these nice 5 feet up. A minute later, 5 feet up. A minute later, 5 feet up. In the lake, you get the waves tend to hit a lot faster and closer together. So if you get 3 foot waves, 4 foot waves, they'll literally be 3 feet apart, 4 to 2 feet apart, and so they'll slap you. So be aware that how the waves form in a lake is very different than how it forms in the ocean. Water temperature is definitely a thing that we've kind of really beat that horse to death. So I'll skip that one. A big one that I find in lake entanglement and rivers as well. You get a lot of really poor fishermen that get out there and they lose their lines. I've been tangled up in more than one fishing line in lakes and rivers, and I've got stuck on fish hooks. The last time I got stuck on a fish hook, I was trying to save a 5 foot sturgeon. He was laying on a thing of rope. And he wasn't moving. And usually about 3 or 4 minutes after they swim off, and I tried to move him off the rope, and he wouldn't move. And so I literally grabbed him around. He was this big around at the head, and I moved him, and he had a big fish hook stuck in the bottom of him, stuck to this rope. And so I had to de-hook him from that. Unfortunately, as he moved, that hook stuck right through my dry glove. And at 100 feet in the river, a fish hook pricking your freaking dry glove is a lot. And it filled it up, and the water was lovely 33 degrees at that time as well. So that made it even better. So my hand got very, very cold, and I just went ahead and discontinued my dive. But be aware that definitely entanglements happen. I got entangled up in a bunch of boat rope, 1 inch boat rope. Somebody just tossed it in the middle of the lake, and it got around my ankle and around my fin, and it took me a minute or two to get out from under as well. So entanglements are definitely a thing to be aware of in lakes.
And hope it's not 50-year-old rope.
Yeah, exactly. And you'd say screw it. Exactly. Well, hopefully it's not. But other things to be aware of, how we're getting in, safe entry, especially in river diving. River diving is not the easiest diving I've ever done, but it's some of the most rewarding as well. I like river diving. It's definitely a lot of enjoyment, but usually there's a lot of climbing involved. So be aware, what's my entry look like? When we dive the Snake River over here, there's a fairly steep hill to go down into it, and then it gets into some really sticky mud for about 10 feet out, and then you can get out to it. So figure out how you're going to get in and how you're going to get out, because getting out through that, it's 1 foot deep of sticky mud that you literally, if you step on it, you sink down oh, good, 8 to 12 inches and you're stuck. It's like, it almost feels like quicksand. It's definitely a challenge. So figure out what your safe entry is and how you're going to get out. Environmental conditions are definitely a big thing. If you're going to dive like Firehole River, which is a really fun dive, make sure you understand what the current's like. The fastest current I've been in over there was 500 cubic feet per minute. And that's pretty freaking fast. So be aware that as you're kind of fighting your way through that current, where do I need to be? What does my weighting need to be like? Most rivers, I add another 4 to 5 pounds at least to give myself a little better control in the river because of the current. I don't need the weight for normal buoyancy, but in the weight with the extra current, a little extra weight goes a long way. But make sure your BC is also rated for that. You know, if you're diving a 22-pound wing and you've got 20 pounds because of your dry suit and you're adding an extra 5 pounds, that could be a problem. So, make sure that your gear is in rate with what you're getting ready to do as well. Also be aware of diving rivers. It is not uncommon in the wintertime to dive a river below freezing. The coldest river I've dove was 29 degrees on a constant dive. It warmed up at 80 feet to a brisk 31 degrees. So an hour dive at 31 degrees definitely can start cooling you down. At 32 degrees, I'm usually good for about an hour and a half in my dry suit, but after that, I'm ready to be done and have some hot cocoa. So be aware, water temperature is definitely a thing. And as you start getting into rivers, an entanglement can be a real scare for you as well. So especially when you're starting getting current. And then the last thing, dealing with current isn't always constant. Everybody thinks current, it goes in a straight line, right? It goes just like this, right? Current in a river is definitely can be a little wieldy, and sometimes it'll be an up current, sometimes it'll be a down current, sometimes it'll be a side current, sometimes it'll be a straight current. So being aware that you can certainly get into situations like on your safety stop where you can find a rampant up current is absolutely a thing. Be careful as you're going up and ascending in a river to make sure you understand how the current flows. A perfect example, I was doing a deco dive out at Snake River in Johns Hole, and I'd gotten down to 100 feet. I was running twin sets, had my extra weight. I was doing good to go. I was diving and had everything I needed, right? At 50% gas, I had built up about 20 minutes, somewhere in there of deco. And so I started my ascent and got to about the 30-foot mark, and everything was going good. I was coming up along a wall on the river. Everything's fine. It was a nice straight current. When I hit the 29-foot mark, all of a sudden the current changed because of the vertical climb and the wheel of the river. And all of a sudden I was in a strong up current. It flushed me straight up. And I got to the 15-foot mark. My first deco stop was supposed to be at 25 feet. I was able to grab a smooth piece of a rock with 3 fingers. I couldn't get a 4th finger under it. And it held for dear life, trying to stay down without popping the surface because that current was going up. One of the things that happens in an up current within a dry suit, it forces all the air to the feet of your dry suit. And as you're holding on with 3 fingers and your feet are directly above you, you pray to God that you have the strength to hold on for 20 minutes I felt like Cliffhanger. I held him on a helicopter for 20 minutes with 3 fingers, the Guardian. That was it. With 3 fingers, you feel like the Guardian, right? Can I do that? Well, I couldn't, to be very frank with you. So when I lost my grip, I was able to watch one computer and grip it, but there was nothing else to grip onto. I flushed to the surface at the 17 minutes of deco left. Luckily, I was able to paddle back. I was up for about 5-10 seconds, and I dropped down to 20 feet, and I remained out for my entire deco time. Plus, I stayed another extra 10 minutes, came up to 15 feet at a softer spot, and stayed there for another 10 minutes as well. So did extra time, but it's definitely one of those things that happens. You've got to be aware of and be very cognizant of how you're coming up in a river and where the current dynamics are. And where we get those fun rivers is at altitude. They're fun to dive. There's over and the river outside of Jackson. There's a place I've been wanting to dive for a long time. It gets down to 100 feet and goes through about 40 feet of cave and flushes to the other side of the other side. I think it's called Washing Machine, or is it picnic table? I think it's washing machine. But anyway, you dive down at the beginning portion of it, and then you let go, and it flushes you 40 feet through through a cave opening to the other side. I've been wanting to do that one for a while and just haven't done it. But be aware, current is definitely, it's not for the faint of heart. You want to make sure that you understand what you're getting into and what you're dealing with. Now, the final thing to be aware of, I don't think we really need to go through stop, breathe, think, act, but we definitely need to go through basic emergency procedures. As you guys are preparing for this, realize that high altitude diving generally means that you're at least 2 to 3 hours away from emergency medical services. At best, an hour, right? So as you start thinking about this, start planning, what is the location and where is emergency services? Are you carrying an O2 kit? Now, the good news is an O2 kit is fairly inexpensive. You can go over to Airgas or Norco, and for about $200, you can set yourself up with a nice 19 cubic foot tank, air tank, oxygen tank with a regulator on it, a cannula hose, as well as a full cannula mask. It's pretty cheap, about $200. You can pay the same thing, $600 from Dan, or about $200 from Norco, right? But if you have a DCS issue or any type of dive malady on location, and you're an hour away from emergency services, what are you going to do? What does that look like, right? So I encourage you guys, spend the extra $200. I mean, for the love of God, has anybody, if you added up all your dive gear together, has less than $200 of dive gear? Dave Herring? If I added up the cost of all your dive gear, would it add up to less than $200?
No, I wouldn't. Not
No?
close.
Huh. How about you, Dave Kingsley?
No.
I keep hoping, right? I know what I spent on my dive gear, so I know what it costs. But
Scuba was looking pretty promising.
Yeah. So $200 for your own bottle of oxygen in a duffel bag is a pretty cheap solution to be able to increase your safety margin. So David?
Is there a class on O2 training?
There is. React Right is part of Stress and Rescue. I strongly encourage that class as an add-on to any diver's portfolio of knowledge. It needs to be renewed every 2 years. It's definitely a good idea. I would guess most of the divers here have gone through a stress and rescue of some kind, but if you haven't, it's definitely something I would encourage. O2 provider, first aid, CPR, and AED are definitely amazing classes. I'm an instructor in all 4 of those, and I enjoy teaching them as well as part of it. So, and also whenever I go diving, I have 2 bottles of oxygen in the back of my truck, and I've got a full first aid kit. Other thing that Nikki and I considered, we looked at 58% of all dive maladies are cardiac related. So we went ahead and used our HSA, and we bought an AED. So my wife and I keep an AED in the back of my truck as well, ready to go. So be aware, having a few basic things definitely goes a long way. And while most divers probably won't buy an AED, I think we spent damn near $3,000 on that thing. It's something that I pray to God, knock on wood, I never have to use, but I've got it in case. So I have been in a situation where I wanted an AED and did not have one. And we made the decision that we won't do that again. But we've always had oxygen in the back of our truck. The other thing to be aware of is whenever you're going diving, what's the distance to the local pressurization chamber? What's the closest one? Where does that look like? If you have an O2 kit and you can get of a 19 cubic liters, that should be enough for about an hour and a half of oxygen for a diver. Can you get them to a pressurization chamber in an hour and a half? Something to think about, right?
Is a good way to find that through a dive shop?
The dive shop. Here's your good news, David. There's 4 in Idaho Falls, 2 at Ermac and 2 at Mountain View. You'll be surprised how many chambers are around you sometimes. Figure out what the distance to them is, where they're at, how you get to them. And then figure out what's the farthest distance I'm going to be from my chamber and have enough oxygen accordingly. So my wife and I have 2 bottles of oxygen. We've got enough for 3 hours of oxygen for a diver. So because we figured the farthest will be is 3 hours from a pressure chamber. So be aware. What does that look like? What does my first aid kit have in it? What am I prepared with and ready to go with? So I always say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So think about that. and I encourage you guys, especially being altitude divers, having O2 in the back of your car ready to go and check it once in a while. I actually found out that one of my new cylinders had a bad neck seal on it, because we check it whenever we do the React Right course, which I end up teaching React Right about once every 6 months to once every 4 months, somewhere around there. And I pull it out and I check them every 3 or 4 months. And one of my tanks kept coming up empty. I'm like, what the hell? So luckily we have two. We have a backup, right? Redundant. So think about that as you guys go through that process. The other big concern, we talked about this, is dehydration. It's one of the biggest concerns for altitude diving. And there's a lot of contributing factors to that as well. Just feel the symptoms are dry mouth and tongue, feeling thirsty, dry mouth, urinating and sweating less than usual, dark colored urine, dry skin, feeling tired and dizzy. I think we all pretty much get that. And as we got to go through the process, I think we've all got a pretty good handle on hypothermia as well. But have you guys dealt with IPO, or immersion pulmonary edema? Who's heard of this one before? Justin has. Good. Well, it's definitely something newer. Here's where we got our first incident of immersion pulmonary edema really kind of coming to the surface in the diver world. 2016, there was a diver in England, and they were doing a dive class at a local quarry. It was about a 300-meter swim from where they started at the shore to where they were going to do their deep dive. The diver was going out doing a deep class with an instructor and an assistant instructor. All three divers were wearing twin sets. They got out to the 300-meter mark, and the diver, who was slightly overweight, who had filled out a clean bill of health form saying he had no issues, complained of being tired and out of air and not able to breathe. That was his initial symptoms. So as they gave him time to relax, then they finally decided to dive to the 130-foot mark on this sunken boat that they had there. At about the 10-minute mark, they decided to go ahead and start their surface, and the diver, driving twin LP80s, motioned to the instructor that he was out of gas. The instructor immediately had the assistant instructor provide his safety second and share air. They got to the 30-foot or the 20-foot mark where they began their safety stop, and the student again indicated that he was out of gas. Well, he knew that he couldn't be out of gas because he was breathing on the regulator from the assistant instructor. But he felt, well, maybe there was a problem with the safety second for the assistant instructor. So he went ahead and shared air from his gas, knowing he had plenty of gas, sharing his primary over and taking his safety second on his twin sets. The student again indicated, I'm out of gas, breathing off the instructor's set, and tried to panic and head to the surface. The instructor, realizing that they needed to do a safety stop, held the student in place for another 1.5 to 2 minutes on the safety stop before ascending to the surface. Once they ascended to the surface, the student passed out and went into cardiac arrest. They immediately tried a couple rescue breaths and then drug him to shore, performing CPR at the shore, calling EMS, but unfortunately the student expired. In his autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the student had drowned. His lungs were full of water. The court case tried to find the instructor guilty and eventually did not found him non-negligent, but they tried to hold him accountable because he had held the student down during the safety stop. Okay, scary stuff. Here's what had actually happened. The student had been later on found that he was hypertensive and had high blood pressure, was taking medication for both. But because the student was taking medication, he determined that it was not a problem, and he filled out his medical form as being clean. Pretty scary. Now, hypertension and high blood pressure are both precursors for immersion pulmonary edema. What had happened is that the student had actually, his alveolar had actually started to sweat and build up liquid from his bloodstream into his lungs, causing the liquid and water in his bloodstream to literally liquefy into his lungs and cause him to drown internally. He was breathing plenty of air. So here's the thing: immersion pulmonary edema is primarily brought on by cold water and hypertension, but can be a symptom and sign of somebody diving cold water and that is overweight as well, or in normal blood pressure as well. It's mainly brought on by cold water and hypertension, though. So some of the signs and symptoms of it: not able to catch air, excessive tiredness, confusion, swimming in the wrong direction, inability to carry out normal functions, belief that a regulator is not working, indicating out of gas when the regulators are found to be working correctly and with adequate gas, diver refusing or rejecting an alternate air source when out of gas, indications of difficulty breathing when on the surface. Now, here's what you can do for it. You can sit them upright if conscious, give an oxygen, keep them warm, and do not give them fluids. And it is essential that medical advice be sought immediately. So
what happened there, Benjamin, is basically he got water in the lungs?
He drowned internally. His body created water in his lungs through the alveolar in his lungs.
Okay.
He didn't inspire any water.
Right.
That's not what happened. He literally drowned internally.
And that was caused because he was cold and then had some other issues on top of that.
Exactly. He was hypertensive and had high blood pressure. So he literally drowned internally. So it's something to be aware of. It's definitely a diver with breathing difficulties and not exercising particularly strenuously. Breathing difficulties may be an indication of rapid or uneven breathing or coughing uncontrollably as well. So definitely be aware that it's something if you have a diver that's overweight or hypertensive or high blood pressure, it's definitely something that can happen, especially diving cold water. Diving cold water is one of the key indicators. So be aware. Immersion pulmonary edema is a real thing that happens.
Is that similar to like pneumonia kind of thing where it produces basically fluid in the lungs then and drown?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, exactly. And it's a new thing, and it's just starting to come out. The dive agencies are now aware of it, and we're starting to see GUI just released it out in some of their tech stuff. And RAID is in their higher tech stuff, SSI and SDI. It's still not hitting their tech stuff. So unfortunately, it's just not quite there yet. So be aware, it's definitely something that is happening in there. So again, the value to what we talked about tonight, the majority of inland diving is at altitude and can present certain risks that may not be as simple as diving at sea level. This course was designed to prepare you to dive these additional challenges, and I will be sending out a cheat sheet for you guys as well to help remember some of the notes as well. But hopefully you guys took notes as well. And good news is you can always go online tomorrow and you can watch this course again and again and again and again. I encourage watch at least 10 or 15 times. I'm just kidding. Don't. Certainly do that if you'd like. There are other cool things on my channel as well. As you guys saw at the beginning on the channel, Teach Me to Dive, I was showing you the interview with Richie Kohler, who is one of the shadow divers. And if you haven't read the book Shadow Divers, you should. Good book. Really interesting. Really crazy. They were doing some crazy stuff. I think my favorite quote from Richie Kohler, diving air to 200 feet and nitric narcosis and hypercapnia. He said their favorite saying back in the 80s and 90s was, been there, dove it, forgot about it. So that's what we talked. So I got a final exam. We'll just go round robin on this. Let me get back to my final exam. I'll put it up here. And we'll start with Justin will be our first victim of the day. What is the minimum altitude to be considered an altitude dive, Justin?
1,000 feet. B.
B is exactly right. Ding, ding, ding. All right. David Kingsley, what is the maximum recommended altitude for diving?
10,000 feet.
Up to 10,000 feet is exactly right. All right. Tim, there are several contributing factors for decompression illness. Which is the greatest concern for altitude diving?
Dehydration.
Dehydration is exactly right. Michelle, you can identify all high altitude dive sites by the presence of mountainous terrain.
False.
False is exactly right. You guys are just killing it. All right, David Gilmore. At sea level, a flexible gas-filled container is submerged at 33 feet fresh water. At that depth, it has a volume of 1 cubic foot. What will the volume of the container be if it is brought directly to the surface at sea level?
Bravo, 2 cubic feet.
That's exactly right. Good job. All right, Dave Herring. The container from question 5 is brought to the surface, but at an altitude of 3,000 feet. What will the volume be when it reaches the surface?
D, 2.21.
That is exactly right. Going back to Justin. Justin, from the SSI altitude pressure variation table, what is the atmospheric pressure at 4,000 feet?
4,000 feet, it would be A.
That's exactly right. Good job. All right, David Kingsley. Most common dive tables rely on a minimum hydrostatic cap of blank at the surface.
1 ATA.
That's exactly right. All right, Tim. A diver plans a dive at 4,000 feet to 70 feet fresh water. What is the sea level equivalent depth for the sled?
Well, according to the calculation, it's 80 feet, but I think according to the chart, it says 90.
Which is
It is exactly right, and I will be correcting that. Thank you guys for catching that, by the way. So that is awesome. All right. And Michelle, what advantage does a valve with separate outlets provide an altitude diver?
It's the redundant system in case one has a problem.
Ding, ding, ding. Very good. David Gilmore. What is the preferred method of preventing hypothermia when altitude diving?
Use of a dry suit.
Absolutely. Now, David, I just have one question. Do you have daughters?
I do.
So you have the Gilmore girls. That's perfect.
I do.
Saw that coming.
Dave Herding. Safety stops depth should be adjusted as you ascend in altitude.
True.
That is exactly right. All right. Let's see. Justin, I believe. A number of water skills are vital to managing risks on every dive. Which of the following skills is most critical for altitude diving?
I'm dyslexic, so I'm reading it. I'm sorry.
You're fine.
Ascent rate control. I know you've been pointing your finger at it for a while.
Absolutely. Good job. We didn't really talk about that, but it's kind of in the inherent. All righty. Let's see. David Kingsley, a diver completes a dive to a sled of 60 feet fresh water for 45 minutes. What is the minimum surface interval time before ascending 4,000 feet in altitude to become an A group diver? Remember, 2 hours for every 4,000 feet.
All right, say that last part again.
2 hours for every 1,000 feet.
Okay. 8 hours.
8 hours, exactly right. All righty. And let's see, I've got a couple more. A diver completes travel from a location that is 5,000 feet above his home location for a dive. What letter group for residual nitrogen would the diver need to start with to account for the elevation difference?
Foxtrot. So
Foxtrot, right. Good job. All right, diver. Let's see. What the heck happened to my thing here? I swear these charts get goofy once in a while, all by themselves. There we go. A diver completes travel from his home location that is 3,000 feet above his home location for a dive. How long would he need to wait prior to diving? If we use the chart. Let's see, who are we on? I'll just pick on Dave. Dave Herring. 3,000 feet.
You're going to have to zoom in a little bit. So it would be the D column. So
that's probably why I had it zoomed in.
So D C 549.
549 is exactly right. Good job, guys. All right. That completes up our class for altitude diving. Hold on one second. I'm going to mute myself for just a second. At 9 o'clock, my lights start going off automatically. So I had to turn them back on with the stupid Alexa. So there we go. That's all we have for altitude. What questions do you have? We went through quite a bit. Justin, we'll start with you.
Which question you want me to ask first?
The one that's most pertinent to you. While you're thinking about that, I'll show you guys one of my coolest finds on at DEMA. I keep these, and they are awesome. This is a heat pack that's reusable. There's a little clicker. You have to use hot water, but
hot water.
You hit the little clicker, and it gets warm. It stays warm for about 45 minutes. I put 2 of these in my dry suit with me, and I stay toasty. Or after a dive, I click one of these on, and it gets my hands warm if I'm cold. But I think they're about $5 each, and just neat little things. So that's I just cleaned up several of them, ready to go for my next dives.
I had a
they
question.
had a really good deal on those things at DEMA.
They did have a great deal on those at DEMA. Absolutely. Who had the question?
I did. Going to altitude after diving, I've heard mixed suggestions from dive shops in Colorado. The main question being centered around, I think it's Blue Hole in New Mexico, is at an altitude of somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 feet. But to get back up to most people in the Denver area, they're when they're leaving there, they go over a 12,000 foot pass on the way home, and then back down, obviously, to Denver at about 5,000 feet, or in our case, it'd be 8,000 feet. Some say don't worry about it. You're in a car. If you start experiencing DCS, stop, wait, turn around, whatever, go back down.
That sounds like a good idea.
Some say treat it like an airplane and wait 18 to 24 hours after diving there. Some say it's a car. It's probably going to be a slow enough ascent from 5,000 to 12,000 feet. It's not a big deal. So I just
the book
wondering.
answer is what we talked about tonight is 2 hours for every 1,000 foot of elevation gain, or you can use the chart and make sure you get back to being an A group diver.
But that was before. That was like going up to
after diving as well.
Altitude.
So after diving,
okay.
2 hours for every 1,000 feet is a good litmus. So if you're going to, after a dive, if you're going to raise 1,000 foot in elevation, wait at least 2 hours for every 1,000 foot of gain after a dive.
So that.
Sorry if I wasn't super clear on that.
Okay.
I've dove that before. That's a really cool place.
That's one of the few that most Coloradans consider local, and it's like 5.5 hours away. So they don't dive a whole lot of other things. So
I actually had a great conversation with the last person to dive the cave there when the guy was when one of the divers died. That was a very interesting. Mike Young from History Breathers. He's a friend of ours. He's the last person to dive that cave and lost his dive buddy during that dive. So
yeah, we saw the interview for that.
Yeah, that was a crazy. When you talk to a diver who says, "I thought I was a goner for 3 separate times during a dive," you're like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't the guy that died? Isn't his rig still down there?
Nope, they were able to recover him.
Okay, they were able to recover that.
Yeah. Justin, what questions do you have?
So we were talking about warmth when it comes to trying to avoid DCS, and I come from a commercial diver background, and one thing that we're told absolutely never, positively ever to do is take a shower, specifically a hot shower after a bath, or a warm shower for even that matter, which kind of for us it kind of goes into a situation of overprotectiveness, I guess you can say, like being overly cautious. What would in terms of scuba, what would be the correct answer for that? Because like I said, we're taught don't ever take a hot shower to warm yourself up after a dive, and especially don't drink like hot liquids after that, because what it does is
Yeah, off gas
accelerate.
fast for sure.
Exactly. So what would eliminate? How can you eliminate the confusion when we go to inform others about the? When I say we, I mean on the scuba side, not the commercial side, because you're not changing those people's mind whatsoever.
No, that's a great question. And the general answer is after heavy diving, hot tubs and hot showers are a really bad idea. Give yourself time to off gas appropriately and reduce yourself to a point where you're at a much lower repetitive or residual nitrogen level. And you can certainly use the residual nitrogen chart for that. If you come out of the water as a K group diver, give yourself 4, 5, 6 hours to get yourself into a much lower position before you take a warm shower. And don't get into a hot tub at all, because you start getting into 107, 108, 109 degrees. You're absolutely doing a heavy off gassing as well. In terms of drinking heavy liquids for recreational diving, warm liquids, yes. Hot liquids directly after dive, not the best idea in the world either. But you definitely warm liquids to warm yourself up and get yourself warm. But realize, the heavier the dives you've been doing, you coming out of the water as a K group diver or even decompression diving, you're absolutely increasing your risk dramatically. And it's part of the reason we say stay warm during your dive. Make sure you exercise the day before your dive. Be well hydrated before your dive, because those will help reduce those factors. But also doing that body decompression is huge. Most people don't realize how much that 10 minutes of just keeping your head out of the water with a body deco really can reduce the amount of nitrogen and reduce that shock to the system as you're getting out of the water as well. But you're absolutely right. Hot liquids right after dive, really bad idea. Hot shower after to warm up naturally. Blanket up. Get yourself warm that way as best you can. I particularly like my heated seats in my truck and the heated steering wheel, but I definitely try to take it easy as well with that as well, to make sure that we're not increasing that warmth too quickly. But again, the bigger thing is don't get cold during the dive. Stay warm. The last thing you want to do is get cold during the dive, but use that gentle warm up afterwards. So those are great questions, and I agree completely. Hot drinks right after. But when you start talking about most recreational scuba diving, most divers aren't going to be coming out of the water as a K group diver, right? At the highest residual nitrogen point. They're going to be coming out as an F and a G. So give themselves time and at least several hours before they take a warm shower and warm up naturally, and hot coffee, hot beverages afterwards, definitely a bad idea. But you're right, exactly on target.
Okay, so here's a question. The problem is I have so much stuff rolling around upstairs. It's hard to think on the moment of a question that's pertains to what we were just discussing. But a good one is that I can think of is there a listing of across the nation of locations for deco chambers? I believe
I think it's going to be a matter of you're going to need to call the local hospital, and the local hospital will have a good idea. Oddly enough, deco chambers are used for more than just decompression sickness. They're used for there's a lot of times for car accidents, for something like somebody gets mediastinal emphysema due to an air pressure, an airbag deployment, right? Which is a pretty common thing. Or through orthopedic surgery, it's very common for somebody to get arterial gas embolisms. In fact, that's the number one killer after orthopedic surgery is arterial gas embolisms. And the best way to get rid of either of those two, the first one with mediastinal emphysema is to decompress the chest with a needle decompression. But the second point is get them into decompression as well, or with an arterial gas embolism after some sort of orthopedic surgery, to get them into a gas chamber to reduce the size of those bubbles so that they become. In fact, it was the last season of Grey's Anatomy. Yes, I watched Grey's Anatomy. Dealt exactly with that. They had a football player come in and get an arterial gas embolism. It was a very realistic situation that could absolutely possibly happen. So you'll find that decompression chambers aren't just for divers, right? We like to think we have the quarter of the market of them, but they're very common for other things. High pressure oxygen therapy as well is a common thing for different types of skin ailments as well as burns as well. So they use them for quite a few things. So call to your local hospital and say, hey, or the local hospital that you can find and say, hey, I'll be in this area. Where's the closest chamber that you guys know of? And just call around and ask. I know because I've done training. I've lived in Idaho Falls for 8 years, as well as I've trained a lot of doctors out at the hospital. And so we know about them because we're here. But they are, and we also know that they're the closest to us as well in terms of for Yellowstone, because if somebody gets injured in Yellowstone, they life flight them to Idaho Falls. So we get all the people who try and pet the fluffy cows.
Yeah, but they have them all over the place. They call them oxygen health spas now. So where you can go in there, and so in an emergency they can be used for many things. But there's one here. I live about 45 miles south of the town called Burley. I don't know if being from Idaho Falls, if you know where that is.
Yeah, I know.
There's one in Burley that they do it, and so yeah.
But can ones like that go to enough depth though?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Can some of those, like the spa ones and whatnot, though, go to enough depth to actually do proper treatment though? Because I know they use hyperbaric chambers for all kinds of things, but like the soft side ones that they use in a lot of spas and stuff, I didn't think could go past like 20, 30 foot equivalent depth or something.
Personally, I wouldn't trust a spa of all places to do deco chamber related things for diving. Then that's coming from a professional commercial diver standpoint. I mean, it's bad enough that in our world, we have people who just got out of dive school running our chambers for us on a non-medical basis. I don't want, personally, I don't think it's very wise to consider like a health spa type of thing with people that are largely untrained in the intricacies of deco chamber operation, because it is an exact science. There's things you have to do or you're going to kill the person.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
that's my point exactly. Is are they trained for decompression medicine? Is it a chamber that's sufficient for that dynamic of pressure, or is it just make me feel good? It's an oxygen bar, right?
Right.
And oddly enough, an oxygen bar, the highest oxygen content they go to is 40%. Woo!
But
yeah, and the depths aren't really that deep either for in those cases. So
there are options to look at, is what I was putting out, especially if you're from a rural place like where I live. Like I said, that's 45 miles from me on an hour drive over a pass. Or the next closest one, I believe, is in Pocatello, where they have, which is an hour and a half drive. So it depends on the emergency or whatnot, and you have to evaluate everything that you can.
You might check Twin Falls Hospital. I think Twin Falls Medical has a deco chamber.
Hour and a half drive.
Yeah.
Either way. So
yeah. So that comes back to the idea of do you have a bottle of oxygen in the back of your car? $200.
Yeah. So it's setting up for different things on it. So, but you have to evaluate the situations that you're at and what you can get.
Absolutely. Michelle, did you have a question?
I was just going to say that there is a website for Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society does list all the chambers from chamber 1 or level 1 to level 4. Again, it's, they just recently updated it at the end of 2023, whether or not that's been vetted by Dan, but it's a tool that could be used. I did have one question though. You had mentioned at the beginning of the session that there's been absolutely no publication, nor will they release anything above the 10,000 foot level as far as math, how it goes. Are we still using the 3.5% per 1,000 foot at that point? Because
yes, I would absolutely use that as at least to get you a starting point. And then if it were me, I'd probably add a 5% safety margin if it were me.
Yeah, because we were talking about Turquoise Lake earlier, and that sits at like a 12,000 foot elevation, actually. 11.5 to 12 somewhere.
Oh, okay.
So as you're doing that, I would still use a 3.5% per, or you can use if you can get the hectopascal atmospheric pressure for the station closest to that, You can use that math. That'll get you about the same place. And then I would add 5%. If it were me, I would just add around about 5% additional. From what I understand, it's exactly what they're doing, is just adding additional safety margin, but that's only hearsay, and I can't prove that, and I'm not a big believer in hearsay.
Well, there's just not the volume of people diving above 10,000 feet.
Sure.
There's no Navy targets worth
They've
testing
written
people out at, right?
If you go to the books, they reference that book and that subsection. It's just the problem is finding anybody that will get you a copy of that subsection. And I've done everything but actually contact NITO directly. And I guess that's going to be my next step, is because I go through my periods of time trying to find it, and I just haven't found it. I do have the Navy Dive Manual 7.1, and I actually printed it off. It's 900 and some odd pages. I've got it printed off behind me.
I think I did find that too. I'll have to look.
You're not the only one.
It's awesome. This is my key dive manuals back here.
Maryland binders. One other question that just kind of came to mind is when we do the equivalency of depth at higher altitudes, we saw a 70-foot dive was closer to a 90-foot dive or an 80-foot dive from that perspective. Have you come across any research where they correlate the 15 zones of on-gassing or your compartments and the rate at which they on-gas at certain depths, and then when you do your deco stops and an adjustment in that depth based off of that? Because
actually, absolutely, no, they're basing all that on Bielmann Z16C, and the off-gassing dynamic as well. So it correlates directly to Bielmann based upon the atmospheric pressure. So you're looking at 16C, which, interestingly enough, we always say there's 16 tissue compartments, but if you look at the Bielmann algorithm, they break tissue compartment 1 into 2 parts, to 1A and 1B. So I would say there's 17 tissue compartments based upon that. But that's neither here nor there. But yes, it absolutely culminates to Bielmann.
Okay, because I was curious of whether or not it changed with the theory of deep stops, and they've kind of moved away from that because you're still on gassing certain compartments but off gassing, and it was a detriment with a deeper stop. But if you're at altitude and your depths are adjusted already by an equivalent depth is deeper than what you truly are, how that factors into some of that.
Absolutely. So here's your problem with deep stops. So deep stops or pile stops, same thing. Here's the most significant thing I can tell you about that. So Robert Pyle, who invented pile stops in the 90s, right, does not use pile stops to this day for his technical diving. That is an absolute fact and true, right? But the problem with pile stops and deep stops is the first part is there was never a clear definition of what a deep stop was. Right. And so what we've done is we've developed a new dynamic in developing deep stops based upon gradient factors. And so what we do is we build a gradient factor, gradient, like I dive a 50-85, which says that I'm going to get to a 50% of M value based upon the atmospheric pressure and the depth and time of the dive. And that's going to be the depth of my first stop, with my second number being 85 being the length of my last stop. It won't let me out of the water until I'm at least 15% safe from M value at that point. So that's what we really replace deep stops with, is the dynamic of using a gradient factor. And we can certainly go into VBM or RGBM2, any of those. And you can take a gradient factor and you can manipulate it to the point where it's basically doing an RGBM or it's doing a VBM, right? So what the more common practice is to use a quality gradient factor against your safety stops. And typically the higher the altitude I go, the lower my GF high is. And so typically in the Caribbean, I'll dive a 55-80, 55-85 in that area, depending upon the dynamic and length and a lot of crap and how I'm feeling as well of the dive. If I'm diving ice, I lower it to a 50-70. And if I'm diving Yellowstone Lake, it's 50-70 to 50-75 is a typical for what I do. So I take a little bit longer on my safety stop based upon my gradient factor high as well. So the gradient factors against Bielmann will absolutely correct and build up a more accurate deep stop than what we could do on our own.
Okay.
because the deep stop springs upon the dynamic of 50% between me and the surface, right? The gradient factor is going against the algorithm of the off gassing of my tissue compartments and which ones are most efficient. So, do you guys use gradient stop or gradient factors?
Yeah.
We do, yeah.
Okay, good.
So familiar with that concept. Did we find out that the shear waters don't go above 10,000 feet for altitude adjustment? Was there a limitation there? Did we find?
It's the shear water is automatic. It bases it upon atmospheric pressure.
Okay.
The shear water, the Apex, the Garmin, those are the most common ones. Are all automatic altitude adjustments. The Suunto is a manual. The Suunto Black does a much better job than the Suunto Core of the altitude adjustment based upon, but it still asks you to set a range, and then the Suunto Black, it does a real nice job of figuring out based upon atmospheric pressure within a zoned range, if that makes sense. So,
yeah.
Like my Sherwood beacon, it basically follows the chart. It adjusts every 1,000 feet.
Sure.
So, and that's one thing that, for simplicity, yeah, but more complicated diving like I want to do, I'm going to have to upgrade to a more accurate computer.
Yep. It depends on what kind of diving you do. Depends on the dynamic of what computer is best for you. For simple single tank ice dives, cold water dives, and whatnot on that, then I use a Suunto Black. It's a great computer. For more complicated dives, for side mount, I use an Apex DSX. It does a great job. For my complicated ocean dives, really, when I start getting really complicated, I move over to Shearwater, especially my deep dives when I'm starting to pass 130, 140 into 150 foot range, because it's got a density on it. I really like that as well. But I'm blessed. I have 5 different dive computers. So I find the kind of the benefit and high point of each one, and I use it to its advantage. This Sunday when I was ice diving, I used the Suunto Black, and it did a great job. It's got a big display, and seeing it through my FFM was really nice. So it depends on what you're into and what you're doing. I found a benefit and use for each one. For deep dives and long dives and really complicated, the Shearwater does a great job because it has that gas density and that delta and delta plus 5. But like I said, for side mount diving and reasonable complex dives, the DSX does a great job as well because it has gradient factor on it. So I would never use a Garmin for a primary. It's a great secondary computer, but as a primary, I would never use it as a primary computer unless I was just a cheap recreational diver. That's all I did. So that's my take on it for the day. What other questions do you have? I'm sure happy. David, we'd probably need to talk for a few minutes after. But other than that, I'm going to end the recording.